The black stallion reared up against the twilight sky, its hooves cutting through the air like weapons of war. 25 men had tried. 25 men had failed. Evelyn Hawthorne stood at the corral fence, her widow's black dress billowing in the desert wind, watching another fool hit the dust. "Is there not one real cowboy left in this godforsaken territory?" she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut bone. The crowd murmured, uneasy. They'd come for spectacle, but found something darker. A woman's grief transformed into an impossible test, and a horse that seemed to understand the difference between pretenders and truth. Before we begin this tale of dust, destiny, and the kind of courage that can't be faked, I invite you to stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels across this wild, wide world of ours. The sun was setting over Dusthaven Valley like a bleeding wound across the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and crimson. It was the kind of light that made honest men look like heroes and cowards like demons, depending on where they stood. On this particular evening in late September of 1887, the light fell hard on the Hawthorne Ranch, where a crowd of nearly 200 souls had gathered for what had become the most notorious spectacle in 3 territories. They came from as far as Silver Creek and Twisted Pine, some riding 2 days just to witness what they'd heard, whispered in saloons and general stores, passed between ranch hands and shopkeepers like forbidden scripture. They came to see the widow's challenge. They came to see men fail. Evelyn Hawthorne stood exactly where she'd stood for the past 6 weeks, every Saturday without exception, at the southeast corner of the main corral. Her position never varied. Her posture never softened. She wore the same black dress she'd worn to her husband's funeral 18 months prior, not out of lack of means, but out of deliberate choice. It was a reminder, a statement, a line drawn in the dust that separated her old life from whatever this new existence had become. She was 34 years old, though the hardness in her eyes could have belonged to someone twice that age. Her auburn hair was pulled back severe and tight, not a strand out of place, as if even her appearance had been disciplined into submission. She'd been beautiful once, still was, if a man looked past the armor she'd constructed around herself. But most men didn't look that deep. They saw the challenge, the prize money, and the horse, especially the horse. Midnight stood in the center of the corral like a piece of living darkness carved from the night itself. He was a stallion of thoroughbred and Mustang blood, 16 hands high, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His eyes were intelligent and wild in equal measure, watching the crowd with what could only be described as contempt. This was not a horse broken by human hands. This was not a creature that had surrendered its spirit to bit and bridle. This was something else entirely. "Who's next?" Evelyn's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a knife through silk. "Surely there's one more man here who thinks he's cowboy enough to last 10 minutes on that animal." The crowd shifted, boots shuffling in the dust. Men looked at their feet or at each other, anywhere but at the widow or the horse. They'd already watched 3 attempts today, 3 failures, just like the 22 failures before that. "Come now," Evelyn continued, and there was something cruel in her tone, something sharp and unforgiving. "Where's all that frontier courage I keep hearing about? All those stories about taming the wild, conquering the untamable? Or is it all just whiskey talk and empty boasts?" "That ain't fair, Mrs. Hawthorne," called out a voice from the crowd. It belonged to Walt Driscoll, owner of the Dusthaven Saloon and one of the few men who'd known Evelyn and her husband before tragedy struck. "You've seen what that devil horse does to anyone who tries. He ain't natural. No shame in a man knowing his limits." Evelyn turned her gaze on Walt, and even from 30 feet away, people could see the ice in her eyes. "My husband rode him. Every day for 3 years he rode that horse, and they moved like they shared one mind, one soul. So don't tell me it can't be done, Walt. Don't tell me about limits. Tell me why real cowboys seem to have gone extinct while my back was turned." The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate. Everyone knew the story. Marcus Hawthorne had been thrown from a green mare on the North Ridge 18 months ago, broken neck, dead before anyone could reach him. Evelyn had found him herself, and something in her had died that day too, something human and soft and forgiving. What remained was this: the challenge, the rage, and the relentless, impossible standard. $500, Evelyn said, her voice dropping lower, more dangerous. $500 in gold to any man who can ride Midnight for 10 minutes. Not break him, not dominate him, just ride him, the way a real cowboy should be able to ride a horse, the way my husband did. $500. In 1887, in a place like Dusthaven, that was 6 months' wages for a working man. That was a new start. That was everything. And still, no one moved. I'll do it. The voice came from the back of the crowd, young and stupid with the kind of courage that comes from inexperience. The crowd parted, revealing a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, all lean muscle and misplaced confidence. He wore the costume of a cowboy, the hat, the boots, the spurs that jangled with each step. But anyone with eyes could see he was playing dress-up in a man's world. "What's your name, son?" Evelyn asked. "Tommy Briggs, ma'am." "I'm from—" "I don't care where you're from. I care if you can ride." Tommy swallowed hard but kept walking toward the corral. His friends cheered him on, their voices too loud, trying to cover their own fear with noise. They'd probably been drinking at Walt's place since noon, working up the courage or drowning the common sense, one glass at a time. Evelyn watched him approach with the expression of someone who'd seen this exact scene play out 24 times before. "You understand the rules?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. 10 minutes. No ropes, no braking gear. Just me and the horse." "And if he throws you?" "Then I guess I ain't a real cowboy." Tommy tried to grin, but it came out shaky. Evelyn nodded to her ranch foreman, a grizzled man named Coop, who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an old accident nobody talked about. Coop opened the gate, and Tommy stepped into the corral. Midnight, who had been standing still as a statue, immediately shifted, his ears pinned back, his nostrils flared. Every muscle in his body went taut, coiled, ready. "Easy now," Tommy whispered, approaching slow. "Easy, boy. I ain't gonna hurt you." The horse's eyes never left him. There was intelligence there, calculation. Midnight wasn't afraid. He was deciding. Tommy got within 10 feet before Midnight moved, not away, but toward. One step, then another, closing the distance on his own terms. Tommy froze, unsure whether this was good or bad. The crowd held its collective breath. "That's it," Tommy breathed. "We can be friends, can't we?" He reached out his hand. Midnight struck like lightning. The stallion's head snapped forward, teeth bared, and Tommy barely yanked his arm back in time. The crowd gasped. Midnight reared up, towering over the young man, hooves slashing the air where Tommy's head had been a second before. "Jesus!" Tommy backpedaled, tripped over his own feet, hit the ground hard. Midnight came down on all fours with a force that shook the earth, then charged. Not to attack, but to dominate. He ran at Tommy, forcing the young man to scramble and roll, coming within inches of being trampled. Tommy made it to the fence and practically threw himself over it, landing in an undignified heap on the other side. The crowd erupted, some laughing, some shouting, all relieved it wasn't them in there. Tommy picked himself up, face red with shame, hands shaking. "That horse is possessed," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ain't natural. Something's wrong with it." "Nothing's wrong with him," Evelyn said quietly, but her voice carried. "He just knows the difference between a cowboy and a boy playing pretend." The humiliation hit Tommy like a physical blow. His friends grabbed him, pulled him away before he could say something stupid that would make things worse. They disappeared into the crowd, heading back toward town and the comfort of Walt's whiskey. Evelyn watched them go with dead eyes. "Anyone else?" she called out. No one answered. "That's what I thought." She turned away from the crowd, facing the corral and the horse. "Same time next week. Keep telling yourselves you're cowboys, gentlemen. Maybe one day you'll believe it." She walked toward the ranch house, her black dress trailing in the dust, leaving the crowd to disperse in uncomfortable silence. They'd come for entertainment, but what they'd witnessed felt more like judgment. A mirror held up to every man present, asking them what they were really made of. Most didn't like the answer. Later that evening, the Hawthorne Ranch house sat on a small rise overlooking the valley. It was a solid structure, built by Marcus's own hands from timber he'd hauled down from the mountain range to the north. 2 stories, wide porch, good bones. It had been a happy house once, filled with plans and laughter and the small, quiet moments that make a life worth living. Now it was just a place where Evelyn slept and waited for Saturdays. She sat on the porch in her husband's old rocking chair, still wearing the black dress, watching the sun complete its descent behind the mountains. The crowd was long gone. Even Coop and the other ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse. It was just her and the silence and the memories that wouldn't leave her alone. "You're being cruel, Evie." The voice came from the porch steps. Walt Driscoll had climbed up so quietly she hadn't heard him. He stood there now, hat in his hands, looking older than his 50 years. "I'm being honest," Evelyn replied without looking at him. "You're being impossible. Marcus was one of a kind. You can't expect—" "I don't expect anything anymore, Walt." She cut him off, her voice flat. "That's the point. I had expectations once. I expected to grow old with my husband. I expected to have children and watch them grow. I expected a life. And then I found Marcus lying in the dirt with his neck broken, and I learned that expectations are just another word for foolishness." Walt climbed the steps and sat down on the porch rail, facing her. "So what is this? Punishment? Revenge against every man because one horse killed your husband? Midnight didn't kill Marcus. A green mare nobody had any business riding killed Marcus. He died trying to prove something that didn't need proving, and I don't even know what it was." She finally looked at Walt, and he could see the exhaustion behind the hardness. "The challenge isn't revenge. It's a question." "What question?" "Whether there are any real men left or if they all died out with Marcus." Walt shook his head slowly. "That horse is dangerous, Evie. You know it. Marcus spent 3 years learning him, building trust. You can't expect a stranger to walk up, and—" "I expect a real cowboy to understand that," Evelyn interrupted. "That's the whole point. 25 men have tried, and not one of them approached that horse with anything but arrogance and force. Not one of them took the time to look, to listen, to understand what they were dealing with. They just saw a prize and a challenge to their pride. And when they fail, you punish them." "I expose them," Evelyn corrected. "There's a difference." Walt sighed and stood up, putting his hat back on. "I can't tell you how to grieve, Evie, but this path you're on, it leads nowhere good. Eventually, you have to let go." "Let go of what? The only standard worth having?" He didn't have an answer for that. He just tipped his hat and walked back down the steps, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Evelyn sat alone for a long time after he left, rocking slowly in Marcus's chair. In the corral below, she could see Midnight's silhouette, black against the deepening purple of twilight. The horse was looking up at the house, at her, like he was waiting for something. "What am I doing?" she whispered to the night. The night didn't answer. It never did. Then, 3 territories away, Lucas Reed stood at the edge of a campfire that was burning down to embers, watching sparks drift up into a sky full of stars. He was alone, the way he'd been alone for the better part of 3 years now. Just him and his bay mare, Rosie, and the weight of things he was trying to forget. He was 37 years old and looked like he'd lived twice that. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined with scars both visible and hidden. He moved with the careful economy of a man who'd learned the hard way that wasted motion could get you killed. There was a stillness about him, a quiet that people often mistook for weakness until they looked into his eyes and saw what lived there. He'd been a soldier once, during the war. He didn't talk about which side or what he'd done. That was finished business, dead and buried like so many other things. After the war, he'd drifted, ranch work, trail drives, anything that kept him moving and alone. He was good with horses in a way that seemed almost supernatural. They trusted him instantly, responded to him like he was speaking their language. Maybe he was. Maybe after years of not being able to speak to people anymore, he'd learned to speak to animals instead. He'd been camped in these foothills for 3 days, hunting work, when the 2 cowboys rode into his camp. They were coming from the south, heading north to wherever men like them went when one job ended and another hadn't started yet. "Mind if we share your fire?" the older of the 2 called out, still 50 yards away. Smart. You didn't ride into a man's camp uninvited in this country. Not if you wanted to keep breathing. Lucas studied them for a moment, then nodded. Coffee's old but still hot. They dismounted and led their horses over, tying them near Rosie. Both men were trail-worn, dirty, and tired in that particular way that came from long miles and longer thoughts. The older one, maybe 45, introduced himself as Frank. The younger, barely 30, was Jesse. Neither offered last names. In this world, that was acceptable. They settled around the fire, and Lucas poured them coffee from the battered pot that had followed him through half a dozen states. They drank in grateful silence for a while. Real cowboys understood that sometimes silence was better than small talk. "You looking for work?" Frank finally asked. "Always," Lucas replied. "Where you headed?" "North. You?" "Same." Frank sipped his coffee, then continued. "We just came through Dust Haven Valley. Strange place, strange situation." Lucas waited. If Frank wanted to tell the story, he would. No point in asking. "There's a widow there," Jesse jumped in, younger and less patient. "Rich widow with a devil horse. She's offering $500 to any man who can ride it for 10 minutes. Lucas raised an eyebrow slightly. 500 was serious money.
"Anyone claimed it?" "Not yet. 25 men tried. 25 men failed." Jesse leaned forward, animated now. "We watched 3 attempts today. That horse, it's something else. Black as midnight, mean as sin. Through every man who tried, one cowboy from Silver Creek swore he could break any horse alive. Lasted maybe 90 seconds before midnight, that's the horse. Sent him flying into the fence so hard, broke 3 of his ribs." "Midnight," Lucas repeated, tasting the name. "That's what she calls him," Frank said. "The widow, Mrs. Hawthorne. Her husband was the only man who could ride that animal. He died about a year and a half ago, thrown from a different horse. Ever since, she's been running this challenge every Saturday. $500 to anyone who can ride midnight the way her husband did." "What's the catch?" Lucas asked. "Catch? $500 is a fortune. There has to be a catch." Frank and Jesse exchanged glances. "The catch," Frank said slowly, "is that the horse can't be broken. You can't rope him down, can't use any harsh gear, can't dominate him. You have to ride him the way he was meant to be ridden. As a partner, not a slave. That's what Mrs. Hawthorne says anyway. She says her husband and that horse had an understanding, a respect. She's looking for someone who can earn that same respect." "In 10 minutes, Jesse added with a laugh. "It's impossible. That horse hates people. We watched him nearly kill that Silver Creek cowboy on purpose. I swear the animal's got murder in his eyes." Lucas stared into the fire, thinking. A horse that couldn't be dominated. A widow searching for something that everyone said didn't exist. $500 that no one could claim. It reminded him of something Marcus Aurelius had written, words Lucas had read once in a book he'd found in an abandoned cabin years ago. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. "Are you thinking about trying?" Frank asked, studying Lucas's face. Lucas shook his head slowly. "I'm thinking about understanding." "Understanding what?" "Why the horse fights. Why 25 men failed." He looked up at the 2 cowboys. "Did any of them try anything besides force?" Jesse laughed again. "What else is there? It's a horse. You climb on, you hold on, you show him who's boss." "Maybe," Lucas said quietly, "or maybe that's why they all failed." Frank nodded slowly, seeing something in Lucas that Jesse missed. "You're different from most cowboys, I think." "I'm not a cowboy," Lucas replied. "Not anymore. I'm just a man who understands horses better than people." "Then maybe you should head to Dust Haven," Frank suggested. "Maybe you're what that widow's looking for." Lucas didn't answer. He just watched the fire burn down, thinking about a black horse with murder in his eyes and a widow in black who'd seen 25 men fail. He thought about standards and respect and the difference between breaking something and earning its trust. He thought about all of this until the fire died completely and Frank and Jesse rolled out their bedrolls and fell asleep. Then he sat awake a while longer, listening to Rosie shift and snort softly in the darkness, and he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would ride to Dust Haven Valley. Not for the money, not for the challenge, but because something in the story called to him.
the way a wounded animal calls for help in a language only certain souls can hear. Dust Haven Valley, the following Saturday. The crowd was smaller this week. Word had spread that the challenge was becoming tedious, that the widow was unreasonable, that the horse was unrideable. But there were still 70 or 80 souls gathered around the corral when Lucas rode in just after noon. He sat on Rosie at the edge of the gathering, watching and listening. No one paid him any attention. He was just another drifter in a territory full of them, dusty and quiet and unremarkable, except for the way he watched the corral. While everyone else focused on the people, the widow in her black dress, the ranch foreman, the current fool about to try his luck, Lucas watched the horse. Midnight stood in the center of the corral like he owned it, like he owned the entire valley. His head was high, ears forward, tracking every movement, every sound. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't nervous. He was assessing, calculating, waiting. Lucas recognized that look. He'd seen it in the eyes of wild mustangs up in the high country, horses that had never known a human hand and never wanted to. But he'd also seen something else in those eyes, something these people couldn't see from where they stood. Loneliness. The horse was alone, completely, utterly alone, and he was angry about it. Probably a waste of time, but I've made it this far, the current challenger was saying. His name was Morgan, apparently, from a ranch 3 days' ride east. He was older, maybe 50, with the bow-legged walk and scarred hands of someone who'd worked with horses his whole life. Maybe he'd do better than the others. Evelyn stood at her usual spot, arms crossed, face expressionless. "You know the rules?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. 10 minutes. No tricks, no force, just honest riding." "We'll see about the honest part." Evelyn nodded to Coop, who opened the gate. Morgan entered the corral with more caution than the others Lucas had heard about. He didn't rush. He didn't reach out with false friendliness. He just stood inside the gate and waited, letting Midnight get used to his presence. Smart, Lucas thought, but not smart enough. Because Morgan was still projecting dominance. It was subtle in the way he held his shoulders, the way he looked at the horse. He was being patient, yes, but his patience was a strategy, a tactic. He was still approaching this as a conquest. Midnight saw it too. The stallion didn't charge this time. He did something worse. He turned his back on Morgan, completely dismissing him, and walked to the far side of the corral. The crowd murmured. Morgan stood there, uncertain. This wasn't violence he could respond to. This was contempt. "Come on now," Morgan said, keeping his voice level. He walked toward the horse slowly. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Midnight kept his back turned until Morgan was within 20 feet. Then, without warning, the stallion spun and charged, not to attack, but to control the space. Morgan had to scramble backward or be run down. Midnight stopped short, snorted, then turned away again. The pattern repeated 3 times. Morgan would approach. Midnight would reject him. The crowd grew restless. "This is ridiculous," someone called out. "Just rope him." "No ropes!" Evelyn's voice cut through the noise like a whip. "That's not the challenge." Morgan tried for another 5 minutes, each attempt ending in the same dismissal. Finally, red-faced and frustrated, he left the corral. "That horse doesn't want to be ridden," he said to Evelyn as he passed. "Not by anybody." "He wanted to be ridden by my husband," Evelyn replied coldly. "Maybe he's just particular about quality." Morgan bit back whatever response came to mind and pushed through the crowd, heading for his horse and the long ride home. Evelyn watched him go, then turned to the crowd. "Anyone else? Or are we done pretending for today?" Lucas dismounted from Rosie. He tied her to a nearby fence post, loose enough that she could break free if something spooked her, and started walking toward the corral. The crowd noticed him the way you notice a shadow moving when you thought you were alone. Something about him. The quiet way he moved, the deliberate stillness, made people step aside without him having to ask. He reached Evelyn and stopped. She looked at him properly for the first time. Saw the weathered face, the old scars, the eyes that seemed to have witnessed things words couldn't describe. He wasn't young. He wasn't flashy. He was just present, completely, utterly present. "You're here for the challenge?" she asked. "I'm here for the horse," Lucas replied. It was an unusual answer. Evelyn frowned slightly. The challenge is about riding him for 10 minutes. I understand. Do you? 26 men have tried. 26 men have failed. I know. Lucas looked past her at midnight, who was watching this exchange with those intelligent, measuring eyes. They failed because they were trying to prove something. To you, to the crowd, to themselves. And you're different? There was skepticism in her voice, but also something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or hope so faint she didn't dare acknowledge it. I'm not trying to prove anything, Lucas said. I'm trying to understand something. Understand what? Why he's so alone. Evelyn blinked, caught off guard. Of all the things she'd expected someone to say, that wasn't it. He's a horse. Horses are herd animals, Lucas interrupted gently. They need connection. They need to belong. Your husband gave him that. When your husband died, the horse lost his herd. Now he's alone, and he's angry about it, and every person who comes into that corral just reminds him of what he lost. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the crowd, which had been murmuring and restless, went still. Evelyn stared at the stranger, this quiet man who'd somehow just spoken the truth she'd been trying not to see for 18 months. How do you... I've been alone too, Lucas said simply. I recognize it. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded toward the corral. 10 minutes. No force. Those are the rules. I'll need longer than 10 minutes, Lucas said. The challenge is, I understand the challenge, but if you want someone to ride that horse the way your husband did, it can't be rushed. Trust takes time. Evelyn wanted to argue. The rules were the rules, but something in her, that small buried part that still hoped, made her pause. How much time? Lucas looked at midnight again. The horse was watching him now, really watching, with an intensity that made some of the crowd shift uncomfortably. Let me have today, Lucas said. Just today. If I can't reach him by sundown, I'll leave and you'll never see me again. And if you can? Then we'll see about those 10 minutes. It was audacious. It broke the structure of the challenge. It asked her to trust a complete stranger with the one thing she had left of her husband. But something in Lucas's eyes, that deep, quiet understanding, made her believe he might be different. Today, she finally said. Until sundown. But the crowd stays. They've come to see the challenge. The crowd leaves, Lucas countered. They're part of what makes him defensive. If this is going to work, it needs to be just him and me. Evelyn's first instinct was to refuse, but then she looked at the crowd. 70 people treating this like entertainment, like a spectacle. And she realized he was right. This had never been about entertainment. Everyone leaves, she announced, turning to face them. The challenge is postponed until this evening. Come back at sunset if you want to see the result. The crowd erupted in protest. They'd come all this way. They had a right to watch. This wasn't fair. Evelyn didn't care about fair anymore. She nodded to Coop, who started herding people away from the corral, his presence and missing fingers enough to discourage argument. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd dispersed. When they were gone, it was just Evelyn, Lucas, Coop, and the horse. You too, Lucas said to Coop. The foreman looked at Evelyn, who nodded. Coop left, though he didn't go far, just to the barn where he could watch from a distance if things went wrong. I'll be on the porch, Evelyn said. If he kills you, I don't want to see it happen. He won't kill me, Lucas replied with quiet certainty. How do you know? Because I'm not going to give him a reason to. With that, Lucas opened the corral gate and stepped inside. Midnight's entire body went rigid, every muscle coiled, his eyes locked onto this new human with laser focus. But Lucas didn't approach. He just closed the gate behind him and stood there, 20 feet inside the corral, completely still. And then he sat down. Right there in the dust, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees. He didn't look at the horse, didn't try to make eye contact or establish dominance or do any of the things every other challenger had done. He just sat and waited. Evelyn, watching from the porch with her heart pounding, had no idea what she was witnessing. But some part of her, the part that had loved Marcus, the part that understood what true partnership looked like, recognized that something unprecedented was beginning. In the corral, Midnight stared at this strange human who wasn't acting like any human he'd known except one. The human who used to sit with him just like this, in the early morning, sharing silence and presence and understanding. The human who'd left him alone. For the first time in 18 months, a crack appeared in Midnight's armor of rage and grief. It was the smallest crack, barely visible, but Lucas felt it, and he waited. The afternoon sun climbed higher, turning the corral dust into gold powder that hung suspended in the air like fine mist. Lucas remained seated in the exact position he'd taken 20 minutes ago, cross-legged in the dirt, hands resting loose on his knees, breathing slow and steady. He looked like a man who could sit there for days if necessary, patient as stone, present as water. Midnight stood 30 feet away, head high, nostrils flaring with each breath. The stallion hadn't moved either, but something in his stance had shifted. The aggressive tension had softened into watchful uncertainty. This human wasn't behaving right, wasn't following any of the patterns that usually ended in conflict. From the porch, Evelyn watched through the window of the parlor, her untouched coffee growing cold on the sill beside her. She told herself she wouldn't watch, that she'd go inside and let whatever happened happen, but she couldn't look away. There was something hypnotic about the stillness in that corral, something that reminded her painfully of Marcus. Her husband had possessed that same quality, the ability to be completely present without demanding anything. She'd watched him gentle half-wild horses using nothing but patience and understanding, time after time. The other ranch hands used to joke that Marcus could talk to animals, but it wasn't talk, it was listening. Marcus listened to horses the way most people never bothered to listen to anything. And now here was this stranger, this quiet drifter who'd appeared out of nowhere, doing the same thing. 30 minutes became 40. 40 became 50. The sun continued its arc across the cloudless sky. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, hunting the grasslands beyond the ranch. Rosie, still tied near the corral, shifted her weight and dozed in the heat. Life continued its normal patterns everywhere except inside that circle of fence posts, where two beings existed in suspended time. Then Midnight took a step. Just one. Forward. Toward Lucas. Evelyn's breath caught. Lucas didn't react, didn't even turn his head. His eyes were half closed, his breathing unchanged. If he'd noticed the movement, and he must have, he gave no sign. Midnight took another step, then stopped, ears swiveling, trying to categorize this situation into something familiar. Every human who'd entered this corral had wanted something from him, had tried to take something. This one just sat there like he had all the time in the world and no agenda whatsoever. It was confusing. Confusion made Midnight curious. Curiosity was dangerous because curiosity meant caring, and caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was what got you hurt when the things you trusted disappeared forever. But still, the stallion took another step. Lucas finally opened his eyes fully, but he didn't look at the horse. He looked at the mountains in the distance, visible over the corral fence. "Pretty country," he said quietly, his voice barely above a murmur. He wasn't talking to Midnight. He was just talking, filling the silence with sound that had no demands in it. "Reminds me of Colorado, up near the San Juan Range. I worked on a ranch there for a season, right after the war. Good people, good horses. Cold winters, though. Snow up to your chest by December." Midnight's ears flicked toward the sound. Human voices usually meant commands, threats, coaxing lies. This voice was different. It rose and fell like wind through grass, like water over stones. Natural, unthreatening. "I had a horse there, a sorrel gelding named Copper," Lucas continued, still not looking at Midnight. He'd been beaten pretty badly before the ranch owner bought him off a drunk trader. Took 3 months before Copper would let anyone touch him without flinching. But the owner, old man named Samuel, he had the patience of mountains. He'd sit in Copper's stall every evening, just sit there reading his newspaper out loud, didn't try to touch the horse, didn't even look at him most of the time, just shared the space. Another step. Midnight was 15 feet away now, close enough that a sudden charge could reach Lucas in seconds, close enough to be dangerous. After a month, Copper started looking forward to those visits, Lucas said. You could see it in the way he'd position himself in the stall, turned so he could watch Samuel without seeming to watch. After 2 months, he started moving closer. Not much, just a foot or two each evening. By the end of the third month, Copper was standing right next to Samuel, close enough that the old man could reach up and touch his neck without even extending his arm. Lucas paused, letting the silence settle back in. Then, very slowly, he reached down and picked up a handful of dust. He let it sift through his fingers, watching it fall. Samuel never did touch him, though, not until Copper touched him first. One evening, the horse lowered his head and rested his nose on Samuel's shoulder, just stood there, leaning against this man who'd sat with him all those nights. And Samuel, he just kept reading his newspaper, but I could see tears running down his face. Midnight was 10 feet away. His body language had completely transformed. The aggression was gone. The defensive anger had been replaced by something tentative, fragile, recognition maybe, or memory. That's when Samuel reached up and put his hand on Copper's neck, Lucas continued softly. No grabbing. No claiming, just contact, connection. And Copper stayed there for an hour, just the two of them, silent, together. 5 feet. Lucas could hear Midnight's breathing now, see the rise and fall of the powerful chest. The horse's eyes were different than they'd been an hour ago. The murder was gone. What remained was something raw and uncertain, a crack in the armor that grief and loneliness had built. I learned something from watching that, Lucas said. I learned that you can't force trust. You can only create the space for it to grow if it chooses to. And you have to be willing to wait, however long it takes, without expecting anything in return. Midnight stood directly in front of Lucas now, close enough to strike, close enough to kill. His head was lowered slightly, his ears forward. Every line of his body asked the same question. Are you real? Can I trust this? Lucas finally, slowly raised his eyes and met the horse's gaze. Not challenging, not dominating, just seeing, just acknowledging. Two beings, both alone, both carrying weight that no one else could understand. I see you, Lucas whispered, and I'm not going to hurt you. The moment stretched, fragile as spun glass. One wrong breath could shatter it. Then Midnight did something he hadn't done with any human since Marcus died. He lowered his head further and very gently touched his nose to Lucas's knee. Just for a second. Just long enough to make contact, to acknowledge that maybe, possibly, this human might be different. Then he pulled back, turned, and walked to the far side of the corral. But something fundamental had shifted. Both of them knew it. Lucas stood up slowly, his muscles stiff from sitting so long. He didn't approach Midnight. Instead, he walked to the fence on the opposite side, leaned against it, and just stood there, giving the horse space, showing that he understood the gift he'd been given and that he wouldn't abuse it. From the porch, Evelyn realized she was crying. She hadn't cried at Marcus's funeral, hadn't cried during any of the 26 failed attempts, hadn't let herself feel anything but cold, righteous anger for 18 months. But watching this stranger earn in 1 hour what she'd been searching for desperately, watching him understand her horse, her standards, her grief, broke something open inside her. She walked out onto the porch, wiping her eyes roughly. Lucas must have heard the door because he turned, saw her standing there, and waited. How did you do that? She called across the distance. I didn't do anything, Lucas replied. I just stopped doing everything. Evelyn walked toward the corral, her black dress catching on the tall grass at the edge of the yard. She reached the fence and stood next to Lucas, both of them watching Midnight on the far side. The horse was watching them back, calm now, present. Marcus used to say something similar, she said quietly. He said most people try too hard with horses. They bring all their human expectations and demands and forget to just be. Your husband sounds like he was a wise man. He was. Evelyn's voice caught. He was everything. And then he was gone, and I didn't know what to do with all that love and trust and partnership we'd built. So I put it into finding someone who could understand Midnight the way Marcus did. But really, I think I was just trying to find Marcus again. Lucas nodded slowly. You can't find what's gone. You can only find what's here. And what's here? A horse who's grieving. A woman who's grieving. And maybe a chance for both of you to stop being so alone. Evelyn looked at him properly for the first time, really looked at him. She saw the scars and the hard miles and the deep exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. She saw someone who understood exactly what she'd been living through because he'd been living through his own version of it. You've lost someone too, she said. It wasn't a question. Everyone I ever cared about, Lucas replied simply. War took some. Time took others. My own choices took the rest. I've been alone so long I almost forgot what anything else felt like. Is that why you travel? To keep running from it? Maybe at first. Now I think I'm just looking for a place where being alone doesn't hurt so much. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, My foreman, Coop, he told me after the 5th or 6th failed attempt that I should stop the challenge. Said I was punishing good men for not being Marcus. Maybe he was right. Maybe I've been so angry at the world for taking my husband that I've been taking it out on anyone who comes near. Anger's easier than grief, Lucas observed. Grief makes you vulnerable. Anger makes you strong. But it's a lie, isn't it? The strength, I mean. Yes, Lucas said. It's a lie. They stood in silence for a while, watching midnight graze peacefully in the afternoon sun. The tension that had defined that corral for months was gone, replaced by something quieter, more hopeful. What happens now? Evelyn finally asked. You've reached him. That's further than anyone else got. But the challenge is still the challenge. Can you ride him? Lucas considered this. I don't know. Today wasn't about riding. Today was about introduction, about showing him I'm not a threat. Riding will require more trust than we've built so far. How much more time do you need? However long it takes. Evelyn turned to look at him. The crowd will be back at sunset expecting to see the 10-minute ride. If you can't deliver, they'll say you failed like all the others. Will they be wrong? No, she admitted. By the rules of the challenge, you would have failed. Then I'll fail, Lucas said with no particular emotion. I'm not here to win a challenge. I'm here to understand a horse. Something about the way he said it, so calm, so certain, so free from ego, made Evelyn realize she'd been wrong about what she was looking for. She'd been testing for dominance disguised as partnership, for control masked as respect. She'd been looking for someone who could replace Marcus rather than someone who could simply be themselves in Midnight's presence. What if I changed the rules? She heard herself say. Lucas looked at her, waiting. What if instead of 10 minutes today, I gave you time, real time, to work with Midnight properly, the way you think it should be done? Why would you do that? Because in 1 hour you've shown me something I've been denying for a year and a half. That horse isn't angry because men aren't good enough. He's angry because he lost someone he loved, and no one since has taken the time to understand that, including me. Her voice broke on the last words. Lucas could see the weight of realization settling on her, the guilt and grief and recognition all tangled together. You couldn't have known, he said gently. You were drowning in your own loss. Hard to see someone else's pain when you can barely breathe through your own. But I should have. Midnight was Marcus's partner, his friend, and I just saw him as a test, a standard. I stopped seeing him as a being with his own heart. You see him now, Lucas pointed out. That's what matters. Evelyn wiped her eyes again, frustrated with herself for crying, for feeling, for being vulnerable in front of this stranger. So if I give you time, what would you need? A week? A month? I don't know, Lucas said honestly. Depends on Midnight. Depends on what he's willing to give. But I'd need to be here, present, every day. Can't build trust in scattered visits. We have a bunkhouse, Evelyn said, making a decision. It's not fancy, but it's clean and warm. You can stay there. Work with Midnight as long as you need. In exchange, she paused, then continued, in exchange, I'd like to learn, to watch, to understand what I've been missing. Lucas studied her face, seeing the genuine desire for understanding beneath the grief and anger. All right, he said, but you should know I can't promise success. Midnight might decide he doesn't want to trust again. That's his right. I know, Evelyn said, but at least we'll have tried in the right way. That's more than I've been doing. They shook hands there beside the corral, a simple gesture that felt like a treaty between two wounded souls. Then Evelyn went to find Coop and explain the new arrangement while Lucas settled against the fence to continue his patient vigil. When the crowd returned at sunset, expecting spectacle, they found Evelyn standing alone in front of the ranch house. She announced that the challenge had been postponed indefinitely, that she was reevaluating what she was actually seeking,
and that they should all go home. There was grumbling, disappointment, accusations that she was wasting everyone's time. She didn't care. For the first time in 18 months, she felt like she might be on a path towards something real instead of just circling the same painful ground over and over. Walt Driscoll stayed after the others left, approaching Evelyn with concern. "What's going on, Evie? Who's that man and what did you agree to?" "His name is Lucas Reed," she replied, "and I didn't agree to anything except to stop being so blind." "Blind to what?" "To the fact that I've been using midnight to punish the world for Marcus's death. That stranger, Walt. He saw in 1 hour what I've refused to see for months. Midnight isn't testing whether men are good enough. He's grieving, just like me." Walt looked toward the corral where Lucas still stood, a distant figure in the gathering dusk. "And you trust this drifter? You don't know anything about him." "I know he understands loss," Evelyn said. "I know he understands horses. And I know he's the first person who didn't approach midnight like a problem to be solved or a trophy to be won. That's enough. And the $500? Forget the money. This was never really about money anyway." Walt shook his head slowly, but didn't argue further. He'd known Evelyn long enough to recognize when her mind was set. He just hoped this stranger deserved the trust she was placing in him. That night, Lucas settled into the bunkhouse with his few possessions: a bedroll, a spare shirt, a battered copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that he'd been carrying for years, and nothing else. The other ranch hands gave him cautious nods but kept their distance. Word had spread about what happened in the corral, and they weren't sure what to make of this quiet man who'd done what 26 others couldn't. Lucas didn't try to explain or socialize. He just lay on his bunk, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into night. Horses shifting in the barn, wind through the eaves, somewhere far off a coyote calling to its pack. These were sounds he understood, a language that required no translation. His last thought before sleep took him was of Midnight's eyes in that moment of contact, the vulnerability there, the desperate hope beneath layers of protective anger. He'd seen those same things in his own reflection once, years ago, before he'd learned to bury them deep. Maybe this ranch, this widow, this horse, maybe they were offering him a chance to unbury some of what he'd hidden. Maybe this was more than just helping a grieving animal find trust again. Maybe it was about finding his own way back to connection, to belonging, to being part of something larger than his solitary wandering. Or maybe he was just fooling himself, reading meaning into what was simply another temporary stop on an endless road. Time would tell. It always did. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only high desert country can produce. The sun rose blood red over the eastern mountains, painting the valley in shades of copper and gold. Lucas was awake before dawn, habit from too many years of military discipline and trail life. He made coffee in the bunkhouse kitchen, strong and bitter, then carried it outside to watch the light change. Midnight was already awake in the corral, standing at the fence facing the bunkhouse. Waiting. Lucas felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite name. The horse remembered. More than that, the horse was seeking him out. That was trust starting to grow, fragile as new grass, but definitely there. He finished his coffee, set the cup aside, and walked toward the corral. Midnight watched his approach, ears forward, alert but not defensive. When Lucas reached the fence, the stallion walked over without hesitation and stood on the other side of the rails, close enough that Lucas could feel the warmth radiating from his dark coat. "Morning," Lucas said softly. "Sleep all right?" Midnight's answer was a soft exhale through his nostrils, almost conversational. Lucas smiled slightly, the first real smile anyone on the ranch would have seen from him. "Yeah, me too. Strange bed, strange place, but safe. That counts for something." He stood there with the horse for 10 minutes, just sharing space in the early morning quiet. Then Coop emerged from the barn and caught sight of them. The foreman stopped, stared, then slowly approached. "That horse ain't stood that close to the fence for anyone since Mr. Hawthorne died," Coop said, his voice carrying wonder. "How'd you do it?" "Just showed up and sat down," Lucas replied. "Turns out that's all he needed, someone willing to be present without wanting anything." Coop nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "Mrs. Hawthorne, she wants to talk to you after breakfast. Said to tell you whenever you're ready." "I'm ready now."
Lucas found Evelyn in the ranch house kitchen, making bread. Her hands were covered in flour, her sleeves rolled up, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. She looked younger this morning, less like a widow carved from stone and more like a woman trying to find her way forward. "Coffee?" she offered. "Already had some. Thank you, though." She nodded and continued kneading the dough, working it with practiced efficiency. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about creating space for trust instead of demanding it. And I realize I don't actually know how to do that. Marcus did. He had a gift. But me, I learned ranching from my father, and he believed in control, discipline, making things bend to your will." She punched the dough harder than necessary. "It worked for cattle, for land management, for business. But it doesn't work for hearts, does it? Horse or human?" "No," Lucas agreed quietly. "It doesn't." Evelyn stopped kneading and looked at him directly. "Teach me, please. Teach me how to see midnight the way you do, the way Marcus did." "It's not something I can teach," Lucas said. "It's something you have to feel. But I can show you what I do, and maybe you'll find your own version of it. When do we start?" "Now, if you want." She looked at the bread dough, the kitchen, the tasks that filled her days and kept her from thinking too much. Then she covered the dough with a cloth and wiped her hands clean. "Now is good." They walked to the corral together, and Lucas explained his approach as they went. "The first thing is to let go of any outcome you're attached to. You can't approach midnight hoping he'll do X or Y. You have to be willing to accept whatever he gives, even if that's nothing." "That's hard," Evelyn admitted. "It's the hardest part," Lucas agreed. "Humans are goal-oriented. We want results, progress, proof that our efforts matter, but horses don't think that way. They live in the present moment. They respond to what is, not what we hope will be." They reached the corral. Midnight was standing in the center, watching them approach. When he saw Evelyn, his entire demeanor changed. Ears back, body tense, suspicious. Evelyn stopped, hurt flashing across her face. "He doesn't trust me." "He trusts who you were when Marcus was alive," Lucas said gently. "But you're different now. You've spent months looking at him as a test instead of a living being with feelings. He knows the difference. Animals always know." "So what do I do?" "Same thing I did. You sit, you wait, you let him come to his own conclusions about who you are now." Evelyn looked skeptical but opened the gate and entered the corral. She walked to the spot where Lucas had sat yesterday and carefully lowered herself to the ground. Her black dress pooled around her in the dust. She felt ridiculous, exposed, vulnerable. Midnight watched her with obvious distrust. This human had been cold for so long, had looked at him with eyes that demanded instead of understood. Why should he believe she'd changed? "This is going to take a while," Lucas said from outside the fence. "How long?" "However long it takes." Evelyn settled in to wait, and Lucas went to start his day's work. Coop had asked him to help with some fence repairs on the south pasture, and Lucas was grateful for physical labor. It gave his hands something to do and his mind space to wander. As he worked alongside two ranch hands, quiet men named Pete and Dutch, who'd been with the Hawthorne Ranch for years, Lucas learned more about what had happened after Marcus died. How Evelyn had retreated into herself, turning hard and distant. How she'd fired two hands for showing what she called disrespect to Midnight, though from Pete's telling it sounded like they'd just been trying to handle the horse normally. How the challenge had started almost accidentally when a traveling cowboy had made the mistake of saying any real man could ride any horse, and Evelyn had issued the dare on the spot. "She's been looking for Mr. Hawthorne in every man who tries," Pete said, hammering a post into the hard ground. "But nobody's him. Nobody can be. So they all fail, and she gets harder, and the whole thing just spirals." "Maybe it stops spiraling now," Lucas suggested. "Maybe," Dutch said doubtfully. "Or maybe you'll end up just like the others, thrown and broke and headed down the road." Lucas didn't argue. They might be right. He'd made contact with Midnight, sure, but that was a long way from riding him, a long way from whatever Evelyn was actually searching for. They worked through the morning, the sun climbing higher and hotter. Around noon, Pete went to fetch water from the ranch house and came back with news. "Mrs. Hawthorne's still sitting in that corral. Been there 4 hours now. Coop's worried she'll get heat stroke, but she won't move. Lucas set down his tools. I'll check on her. He walked back to the ranch proper, and sure enough, Evelyn was exactly where he'd left her. Her face was red from the sun, her dress dusty, her hair coming loose from its braid. But she hadn't moved. And Midnight, Lucas noticed, had moved closer. Not much, maybe 10 feet, but that was progress. How are you doing? Lucas asked from outside the fence. Hot, uncomfortable. Questioning my life choices, Evelyn replied without moving. But I'm not giving up. That's good, but you should drink some water. Determination won't help if you're unconscious from dehydration. She nodded reluctantly, and Lucas fetched her a canteen. She drank deeply, then poured some over her head, soaking her hair and dress collar. Midnight watched this with interest, ears forward. He moved closer, Evelyn said quietly, hope in her voice. He did, Lucas confirmed. He's deciding whether to believe you've changed. Have I? I don't know. Have you? Evelyn considered this seriously. I think so. Yesterday, watching you with him, I realized how much anger I've been carrying, how much I've been blaming him and you and all those other men for not being Marcus, for not filling the hole he left. But that's not fair. That's not their job. It's not Midnight's job, and maybe it's not even possible. Probably not, Lucas agreed. But you can build something new, different from what you had, but still valuable. Is that what you're doing? Building something new? Lucas thought about his years of wandering, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections. I'm trying to learn how. Been alone so long, I forgot what anything else looks like. They were quiet for a moment, then Evelyn said, Stay here, on the ranch. Not just until you work with Midnight. Stay permanently. We need good hands, and you're clearly more than that. I'm just a drifter, Lucas protested. You're a man who understands what matters, Evelyn countered. That's rarer and more valuable than any skill with ropes or cattle. Stay, please. Lucas looked at Midnight, at the ranch spread out around them, at this widow who was trying so hard to find her way back to something real. He thought about permanent places and what they'd cost him before, but he also thought about the emptiness of constant moving, never belonging anywhere. Let me think about it, he finally said. Fair enough. They spent the rest of the afternoon in comfortable silence, Evelyn in the corral and Lucas nearby working on tack repairs that Coop had mentioned needing attention. By evening, Midnight had moved to within 5 feet of Evelyn, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she'd tried. She didn't try. She just sat, being present, letting him decide. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Midnight took the last few steps that separated them. He lowered his head and gently, carefully, touched his nose to the top of Evelyn's head. She gasped, tears streaming down her face. Marcus, she whispered. Oh, Marcus, I'm so sorry. Midnight stayed there for a long moment, as if understanding that she needed to grieve, needed to finally release what she'd been holding so tightly. Then he stepped back, turned, and walked away. But the wall between them had cracked. Like it had with Lucas, Midnight had offered acknowledgement, a chance, a beginning. Evelyn stood up slowly, her body stiff from hours of sitting. She walked out of the corral on shaking legs and found Lucas waiting with a blanket, which he draped around her shoulders even though the evening was still warm. Thank you, she said, her voice rough with emotion. You did that yourself, Lucas replied. I just showed up. No, Evelyn shook her head. You showed me what I'd stopped seeing. That's a gift, Lucas Reed. Don't diminish it. They walked back to the ranch house together, and for the first time since Marcus died, Evelyn felt like maybe, possibly, she might find a way to live again instead of just existing in the shadow of loss. It was a small feeling, fragile and uncertain, but it was there. And sometimes, Lucas thought as he headed back to the bunkhouse, small beginnings were all you needed. The rest would come, or it wouldn't, but at least the door was open now. At least there was a chance. Partra lưu ý, viết 6 miền, 600-500 từ liên kết, liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng,
hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document 14 trong hồng. Part 3. Trust over force. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to everyone on the Hawthorne Ranch. Lucas rose before dawn each morning, made his coffee in the quiet darkness, and walked to the corral where midnight always waited.
The stallion had begun anticipating these visits, positioning himself near the gate, ears forward, watching for that particular figure moving through the pre-dawn shadows. Their time together wasn't structured or goal-oriented. Sometimes Lucas would enter the corral and simply walk the perimeter while Midnight followed at a distance, matching his pace. Other times, Lucas would sit on the fence rail and Midnight would graze nearby, comfortable with the companionship. They were learning each other's language, the subtle shifts in posture and breathing that communicated more than words ever could. On the 5th morning, Lucas entered the corral carrying a soft brush he'd found in the tack room. Midnight eyed it with suspicion. Brushes meant human hands on his body, meant vulnerability, meant trust he wasn't sure he was ready to give. Lucas sat down in his usual spot, cross-legged in the dust, and set the brush beside him. He didn't pick it up, didn't make any move toward the horse. He just let Midnight see it, acknowledge it, decide what it meant. "No pressure," Lucas said quietly. "Just an option, if you want." Midnight circled at a distance, studying this new element in their routine. The brush sat there innocently enough, just worn bristles and a wooden handle, but it represented something significant. Marcus had brushed him every day, long sessions where they'd communicated through touch, where Midnight had felt cherished and cared for. No one had touched him that way since. Lucas waited, patient as always, while the sun climbed higher and the ranch came alive around them. He could hear Coop directing the morning work, cattle lowing in the distance, the clang of someone working metal in the barn, life continuing its patterns while time suspended itself inside the corral. An hour passed, then another. Evelyn appeared on the porch with her morning coffee, watching silently. She'd been observing these sessions every day, learning through witnessing, understanding gradually that what Lucas did couldn't be taught so much as absorbed. It was about presence, about patience, about respecting the autonomy of another being completely. She'd started applying the same principles to her own interactions with Midnight. Each afternoon, after Lucas finished his morning session, she would enter the corral and simply exist there. She didn't try to touch the horse or force connection. She just sat with her grief and her regret and her slowly growing hope, and she let Midnight see all of it. The horse had begun standing closer to her each day. Yesterday, he'd grazed within arm's reach while she sat reading Marcus's old journal, the one where her husband had written about his experiences with Midnight in those early years. The entries were full of wonder and respect, detailed observations about what worked and what didn't, always framed through the lens of partnership rather than dominance. "He's teaching me as much as I'm teaching him," Marcus had written 3 years ago. "Every day, Midnight shows me something new about trust, about how it's built in small moments rather than grand gestures. Today he let me touch his face for the first time. Just a brief moment, my hand on his cheek, and I swear I could feel everything he'd been through before I found him. All the rough handling, the fear, the determination never to be broken. And I promised him silently that I would never be another source of pain, that with me, he would only know respect." Reading those words had broken something open in Evelyn's chest. Marcus had understood that Midnight wasn't property or a tool or a challenge to be overcome. He was a being deserving of dignity and choice. And in the year and a half since Marcus's death, she'd forgotten that. She'd been so consumed by her own pain that she'd stopped seeing Midnight's. Now, watching Lucas sit motionless in the corral with that brush beside him, she recognized her husband's philosophy made manifest in a different person. Lucas had somehow arrived at the same understanding through his own experiences, his own losses. Two men, separated by death, united by their capacity to see what others missed. In the corral, Midnight finally made his decision. He walked slowly toward Lucas, each step deliberate, choosing to close the distance. He stopped directly in front of the sitting man, lowered his head,
and touched his nose to Lucas's shoulder. Lucas remained perfectly still, barely breathing. This was the most sustained contact Midnight had offered, the most vulnerable position he'd put himself in. To move wrong now, to misinterpret or push too hard, would shatter weeks of careful trust building. "Thank you," Lucas whispered, so quiet the words were almost imagined. "That means everything." Midnight held the position for another few seconds, then stepped back and turned his body sideways, parallel to Lucas. An offering. Not surrender, but willingness. "If you want to try, I'm ready to see what you'll do." Lucas picked up the brush with exquisite slowness. He let Midnight see it in his hand, smell it, remember what it meant. Then, moving like he was underwater, he reached out and placed the bristles against Midnight's shoulder. The horse's muscles twitched, but he didn't move away. Lucas applied gentle pressure and drew the brush down in a long, smooth stroke. Dust and loose hair came away, and Midnight's skin rippled in response. Lucas kept the rhythm slow and steady, brushing the same section multiple times before moving to a new area, always giving Midnight time to adjust, to accept, to choose, to stay. On the porch, Evelyn realized she was holding her breath. She forced herself to exhale slowly, quietly, not wanting to break the spell. Coop had appeared beside her at some point, and he too stood transfixed, watching something they'd both thought impossible. "I'll be damned," Coop muttered. "He's actually doing it." "Not doing?" Evelyn corrected softly. "Being. There's a difference." Lucas brushed Midnight for 20 minutes, covering the stallion's shoulder, neck, and back with slow, reverent attention. It wasn't just grooming, it was communication. Each stroke said, "I see you, I respect you, I'm grateful you're allowing this." And Midnight stood there, eyes half closed, gradually relaxing into the sensation of being cared for again. When Lucas finally stopped and set the brush down, Midnight turned and looked at him with an expression that could only be described as gratitude. Then the horse did something extraordinary. He lowered his head and pressed his forehead against Lucas's chest, leaning his weight forward, asking for reciprocal contact. Lucas wrapped his arms around Midnight's head, holding him gently, and felt the horse exhale a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry months of tension and grief. They stood like that, man and animal, both damaged by life, both tentatively reaching toward connection again. "That's enough for today," Lucas said eventually, his voice thick with emotion. "That's more than enough." He released Midnight and walked toward the gate. The horse followed him there and watched as Lucas let himself out, those intelligent eyes tracking every movement. When Lucas was on the other side of the fence, Midnight whinnied, not aggressive or demanding, but conversational. "See you tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Lucas agreed. He turned to find Evelyn and Coop both staring at him with something approaching awe. "What?" he asked, uncomfortable with the attention. "That," Coop said, gesturing vaguely at the corral, "is the most incredible thing I've seen in 40 years of working with horses. It's just time and patience." "No," Evelyn said firmly. "It's gift. What you have, Lucas, the way you understand him, that's not something everyone can do. Marcus could. You can. Most people can't or won't." Lucas shrugged, embarrassed. "I should get to work." "Coop, you mentioned wanting help with the irrigation system?" "Yeah, but that can wait. You should rest, maybe eat something. You've been in there for 3 hours." 3 hours. Lucas looked surprised. Time had dissolved completely while he was with Midnight. "I didn't realize." "Never do, when you're that focused," Coop observed. "Come on, let's get you fed before you fall over." They walked toward the ranch house together, and Evelyn fell into step beside Lucas. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "When do you think he'll be ready? For riding, I mean." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I don't know. Soon, maybe. But it can't be forced. He has to offer it himself the way he offered to be brushed today. If I climb on his back before he's ready, before he's chosen to accept that vulnerability, we'll destroy everything we've built." "I understand. I'm not trying to rush you. I'm just—" She paused, searching for words. "I'm trying to understand what the end goal is. What we're working toward." "Partnership," Lucas said simply. "The kind where both beings have equal say. Where Midnight can refuse if he's not comfortable, and that refusal is respected.
That's what your husband had with him, I think. Not mastery, not control, just honest partnership. Evelyn nodded slowly. Marcus always said midnight taught him more about being human than any person ever did. I didn't fully understand what he meant until now. They reached the ranch house, and Evelyn insisted Lucas come inside for a proper breakfast. He tried to protest that he could eat in the bunkhouse, but she was having none of it. "You're family now," she said. "Family eats at the family table." The words hung in the air between them, surprising them both. Family. Such a simple word, but it carried weight that made Lucas's chest tighten. He hadn't been anyone's family in years, hadn't belonged anywhere or to anyone. The idea that he might belong here, on this ranch with these people, was both terrifying and deeply appealing. Over breakfast, eggs and bacon, and fresh bread that Evelyn had finished baking, they talked about next steps. Evelyn wanted to know what would come after Midnight accepted a rider. Lucas explained that the Stallion would need purpose, work that engaged his intelligence and energy. "Marcus bred him with the Spanish mare we had," Evelyn said. "The foal was sold before Marcus died, went to a ranch up in Montana. Beautiful animal, inherited Midnight's intelligence and temperament. I've thought about breeding him again, building a line of horses with his qualities. There's a market for smart, trainable horses that aren't broken in spirit." "That could work," Lucas agreed. "Give him purpose beyond just being ridden. Let him pass on what makes him special." "Would you help with that?" "The breeding program, I mean. If you stayed." There it was again, the invitation to permanence, to putting down roots. Lucas looked around the kitchen, at the morning light streaming through windows, at Evelyn's hopeful face, at the life being offered to him on a silver platter. Every instinct he'd developed over years of wandering told him to refuse, to keep moving, to avoid the inevitable pain of loss that came from caring about places and people. But another part of him, smaller and quieter but growing stronger, whispered that maybe this time could be different. Maybe this was worth the risk. "I'll think about it," he said again, and Evelyn smiled because she could hear the shift in his tone. The first time he'd said those words, they'd meant probably not. Now they meant maybe. That afternoon, Lucas worked alongside Pete and Dutch repairing fence line on the northern boundary of the property. The physical labor felt good, grounding, giving his mind space to process everything that was happening. Pete and Dutch had warmed to him over the past week, appreciating that he worked hard without complaint, and didn't talk unless he had something worth saying. "You really think you'll ride him?" Dutch asked during a water break, sitting in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Midnight, I mean." "If he lets me," Lucas replied. "Not before." "What's the difference?" Pete wanted to know. "Riding's riding, ain't it?" "No," Lucas said. "There's riding where you force an animal to submit, break their will until they have no choice but to carry you. And there's riding where the animal chooses to carry you, agrees to the partnership. First kind creates a slave. Second kind creates a friend." "That's some philosophical stuff," Dutch said, but he sounded thoughtful rather than mocking. "You learned that in the war?" Lucas was surprised Dutch knew about his military past. He'd never mentioned it. His expression must have shown his confusion because Dutch explained, "You got the look? The way you carry yourself, always aware of what's around you, the scars. My brother was at Shiloh, had the same haunted thing in his eyes that you got." "I try not to talk about the war," Lucas said quietly. "Don't blame you, nothing good to say about it, from what I hear." They fell into companionable silence after that, and Lucas was grateful they didn't push. The war was a door he kept firmly closed, and even here, with people starting to feel like friends, he wasn't ready to open it. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Lucas returned to the corral. He'd developed a habit of spending time with Midnight in the evening too, not working or trying to accomplish anything, just sharing space as the day wound down. Midnight seemed to appreciate these visits, often greeting Lucas with a soft nicker and standing close while they watched the sunset together. Today, though, something was different. Midnight was agitated, pacing the corral, ears swiveling constantly. Lucas immediately went on alert, scanning for threats. Had a predator come near? Was the horse sick or injured? Then he heard it, raised voices coming from the direction of the ranch house. He jogged over and found Evelyn on the porch arguing with a man Lucas didn't recognize. The stranger was well dressed in expensive clothes. His horse, a fine sorrel gelding, tied at the hitching post. "Don't care what your sentimental reasons are," the man was saying. "I'm offering you twice what that animal is worth. $3,000, Evelyn. That's more than your entire herd would bring at market." "I told you before, Gerald, Midnight is not for sale," Evelyn said icily. "Not at any price." "Be reasonable. What use is a stallion that throws every man who tries to ride him? You're running a ranch, not a sanctuary for dangerous animals." Lucas climbed the porch steps, and both Evelyn and the stranger turned to look at him. The man's eyes traveled over Lucas dismissively, taking in the dusty clothes and weathered appearance, and clearly finding him wanting. "Who's this?" Gerald asked. "New ranch hand?" "Lucas Reed," Evelyn said. "And he's the man who'll be riding Midnight within the week, which makes your offer irrelevant, Gerald." Gerald's eyebrows rose skeptically. "This drifter? You're betting on him when 26 other Cowboys failed?" 26 Cowboys tried to dominate Midnight," Lucas said quietly. "I'm not trying to dominate him. I'm trying to understand him. There's a difference." "Pretty words," Gerald scoffed. "But words don't break horses. Skill and strength do." "Exactly why you'll never ride him," Evelyn said coldly. "You don't have the right kind of strength, Gerald. You never did." The insult hit its mark. Gerald's face flushed red. "You're making a mistake protecting that animal. He killed Marcus, didn't he? Indirectly, at least. Marcus was out there trying to prove something because everyone was talking about how that Black Devil was the only horse that mattered to him. If Marcus had been riding any other horse that day— "Get off my property," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to something dangerous. "Right now, Gerald, before I have Coop throw you off. I'm trying to help you. That horse is a curse, Evelyn. Everyone knows it. Sell him to me, take the money, and move on with your life." Lucas stepped forward, placing himself between Gerald and Evelyn. He didn't say anything, didn't threaten, but his presence, solid, unmovable, quietly dangerous, spoke volumes. Gerald looked at him, seemed to reassess his situation, and decided discretion was the better part of valor. "Fine, keep your curse. But when someone else gets hurt or killed, remember I tried to save you from yourself." He stormed off the porch, mounted his horse with less grace than he probably intended, and galloped away from the ranch. Lucas watched him go, then turned to Evelyn. "Old friend?" "Gerald Blackwood owns the biggest ranch in the territory, thinks that gives him the right to whatever he wants. He's been trying to buy Midnight since before Marcus died. Said he wanted to use him for stud, create a line of strong working horses. Marcus refused because he could see Gerald would break Midnight's spirit trying to control him." "Why does he want him so badly?" Evelyn sighed and sat down on the porch steps. "Gerald's competitive. He can't stand that someone else has something he doesn't. And after Marcus died, after the challenge started, it became about proving he was man enough to ride the unrideable horse. His pride got tangled up in it." Lucas sat beside her. "He's not going to give up." "No," she agreed. "He'll keep pushing, keep making offers, keep pressuring, maybe even try to turn the town against me. Gerald's used to getting what he wants." "Then we'll need to show him that Midnight isn't for sale at any price, and the best way to do that is for you to ride him," Evelyn finished, "to prove that he's not broken, not dangerous, just particular about who he trusts." "Yes." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the evening settle over the valley. Then Evelyn said, "Lucas, can I tell you something? Something I haven't told anyone." "Of course." "I'm scared. I'm scared that when you ride Midnight, when you prove that it can be done, you'll take your $500 and leave. That I'll have found someone who understands, someone who sees what Marcus saw, and then I'll lose them too. And I don't think I can survive that loss again." Her voice broke on the last words, and Lucas felt the weight of her vulnerability settle on his shoulders. She was trusting him with her fear, her hope, her heart. That wasn't something to be taken lightly. "I'm not Marcus," he said carefully. "I can't replace what you lost, but I'm not planning to leave either, Evelyn. Not anymore. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay. Help build that breeding program. Work with the horses. Be part of something permanent for the first time in years." "You mean that?" "I mean it." Evelyn turned to look at him fully, and he could see tears on her cheeks reflecting the last light of sunset. "Why? Why us? Why here?"
Because, Lucas said slowly, finding the words as he spoke them, I've been running from connection for so long, I forgot what it felt like to be part of something. And then I met Midnight, and I remembered. That horse is grieving the same way I'm grieving, for things lost, for partnerships ended, for the feeling of belonging somewhere. Working with him, earning his trust, it's been like earning back my own capacity to trust, to hope, to believe that maybe I'm not meant to be alone forever. And what about me? Evelyn asked softly. Where do I fit in this? Lucas met her eyes, seeing the question beneath the question. What are we to each other? What could we become? I don't know yet, he admitted. Right now you're someone I respect deeply, someone I'm grateful to for giving me this chance. Beyond that, I think we both need time to figure out what's possible between two people who've both lost so much. That's fair, Evelyn said, and she sounded relieved that he wasn't rushing into declarations or promises neither of them was ready for. Time. We have that now. We do. The next morning arrived with storm clouds building over the mountains, turning the dawn sky gray and heavy. Lucas went through his usual routine, coffee, sunrise, walk to the corral. But today felt different. There was electricity in the air, a tension that wasn't just from the approaching weather. Midnight was waiting at the gate, and his posture was different too. More alert, more present. Almost expectant, as if he knew something was about to change. Lucas entered the corral and walked to the center. Midnight followed immediately, standing close, invading Lucas's personal space in a way he never had before. The horse's eyes were bright, focused, asking a question Lucas could feel but couldn't quite articulate. What is it, friend? Lucas asked quietly. What are you trying to tell me? Midnight turned and walked away, then stopped and looked back over his shoulder. Come with me. The message was clear even without words. Lucas followed, and Midnight led him to the far side of the corral, where a saddle and blanket had been hung on the fence. Marcus's saddle, Lucas realized. Evelyn must have put it there. Midnight stopped next to the saddle and waited, his whole body vibrating with anticipation or nervousness or both. Lucas's breath caught. You're telling me you're ready? The horse didn't move, just stood there with the saddle beside him, offering himself to this possibility. All right, Lucas said softly, if you're sure. But we go slow, and if you change your mind at any point, we stop. Your choice. Always your choice. He picked up the blanket first, let Midnight smell it, remember it. The horse's nostrils flared and his eyes went distant. The blanket smelled like Marcus, carried echoes of the man who'd died. Lucas draped it carefully over Midnight's back, smoothing it gently. The horse trembled, but didn't move away. Then the saddle. Lucas lifted it slowly, telegraphing every movement, giving Midnight every opportunity to refuse. He set it gently on the horse's back, and Midnight flinched but held steady. Lucas worked quickly to secure the girth, not tight enough to ride, but tight enough to let Midnight feel the weight and pressure. That's good, Lucas murmured. You're doing so good. Just wear it for a minute. Get used to it again. They stood there while Midnight adjusted to the sensation of wearing tack for the first time in 18 months. The horse shifted, tested the weight, remembered what it meant. His breathing was rapid, nervous, but he wasn't panicking. Lucas began removing the saddle after 5 minutes, but Midnight turned his head and bumped Lucas's shoulder with his nose. Not yet. Not done. You want to try? Lucas asked, understanding the communication. You want me to try sitting on you? Midnight didn't respond in any way Lucas could articulate, but he felt the answer in his bones. Yes, I'm ready. I'm choosing this. Lucas tightened the girth properly, checking everything twice, then led Midnight to the mounting block that sat unused in the corner of the corral. The horse followed willingly, understanding what was about to happen. From the ranch house, Evelyn watched through the kitchen window, her hands pressed against the glass. She'd woken to find Lucas already gone, had seen him in the corral with Midnight and the saddle, and now she was watching something she'd never expected to see again, someone about to ride her husband's horse. Coop appeared beside her, and they watched together in breathless silence. Lucas stood on the mounting block, eye level with Midnight's back. The horse was trembling now, full-body shudders that spoke to both fear and courage. Every instinct probably screamed at him to run, to fight, to refuse this vulnerability. But he stood there, choosing to trust, choosing to try.
I'm going to put my weight on you now, Lucas said quietly. Just a little at first. Tell me if it's too much. He leaned forward, pressing his hands into the saddle, adding his weight gradually. Midnight's legs locked, but he didn't move. Lucas eased more weight, then more, until he was bent over the saddle, feet still on the mounting block. Midnight's breathing was harsh, frightened, but he held steady. You're incredible, Lucas whispered. So brave. I'm going to swing my leg over now. Slow. You ready? He didn't wait for an answer because there wouldn't be one. He just moved with exquisite care, bringing his right leg over Midnight's back, settling gently into the saddle. For one crystalline moment, man and horse were perfectly still, both processing what had just happened. Lucas was mounted. Midnight was carrying him. The impossible had become real. Then Midnight took a step. Just one, testing, feeling the weight distributed across his back. Then another step, then another. He began walking a slow circle around the corral, and Lucas sat loose in the saddle, hands gentle on the reins, not directing or controlling, just moving with the horse's rhythm. They completed one circuit, then another. Midnight's trembling eased as he remembered this sensation, remembered what it meant to carry someone who respected him. The storm clouds overhead broke open and rain began falling, soft at first, then harder, turning the corral dust to mud. Neither Lucas nor Midnight seemed to notice. They walked through the rain, circles within circles, rebuilding a partnership that had been broken by death and grief and time. Lucas could feel Midnight's muscles relaxing beneath him, could sense the horse's fear transforming into something else. Not happiness exactly, but peace, acceptance, a willingness to move forward into whatever came next. On the porch, Evelyn stood in the rain, tears and water streaming down her face, watching her husband's horse carry another man with the same grace and trust that had once defined Marcus and Midnight's bond. She'd thought she was looking for someone to replace Marcus, but she'd been wrong. She'd been looking for someone who understood what Marcus had understood, that true partnership could never be forced, only offered freely by both sides. And Lucas had proven he understood that, had proven he was worthy of Midnight's trust, had proven maybe that he was worthy of her trust too. Part 4. Louis Viet 6,065 liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document 14-03. Part 4. A different kind of victory. The rain continued falling in steady sheets as Lucas and Midnight completed their 10th circuit of the corral. Water streamed down Lucas's face and soaked through his shirt, but he remained focused entirely on the horse beneath him, on the rhythm of Midnight's gait, on the subtle communications passing between them through pressure and balance and breath. This wasn't mastery. This was conversation, each movement a word in a language only they spoke. After 15 minutes, Lucas gently brought Midnight to a halt near the center of the corral. He sat quietly for a moment, letting the horse feel the stillness, then slowly swung his leg back over and dismounted. His boots hit the muddy ground with a soft squelch, and he immediately moved to Midnight's head, placing both hands on either side of the stallion's face. "Thank you," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me, for being brave enough to try again." Midnight leaned into the touch, pressing his forehead against Lucas's chest the way he had days before, and released a long, shuddering breath. The horse was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. The effort of overcoming fear, of choosing vulnerability, had drained him completely. Lucas began removing the tack with careful hands, talking quietly the whole time. "You did so well, better than well. You were magnificent, and tomorrow, if you want, we can try again, or we can wait. Whatever you need. This is your journey as much as mine." By the time he'd removed the saddle and blanket, Evelyn had crossed the yard and stood outside the corral fence, rain-soaked and radiant with something that looked like joy mixed with grief. Coop was beside her, and several ranch hands had emerged from the barn to witness what they'd all thought impossible. Lucas led Midnight to the gate and opened it, stepping out with the horse following close behind. Everyone tensed, expecting the stallion to bolt for the open range now that he was free of the corral, but Midnight simply stopped beside Lucas and waited, making it clear he had no intention of going anywhere. "I'll be damned," Coop breathed. "He's actually gentled. Really, truly gentled." "Not gentled," Lucas corrected, running a hand down Midnight's neck. "Just understood. There's a difference." Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes never leaving the horse. "Midnight," she said softly, and the stallion's ears swiveled toward her voice. May I touch you?" She reached out slowly, giving him every chance to refuse, and placed her hand on his shoulder. Midnight stood still, accepting the contact, and Evelyn's face crumpled. She pressed her forehead against the horse's neck and wept openly, her shoulders shaking with 18 months of suppressed grief, finally released. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his wet coat. "I'm so sorry I couldn't see what you needed, that I was so lost in my own pain I forgot you were hurting too. Marcus would have known. Marcus would have helped you, and I just used you to punish people who didn't deserve it." Midnight turned his head and gently bumped her back, and Lucas felt his throat tighten at the gesture. Forgiveness, offered freely. Connection, rebuilt through honesty and tears and rain. The ranch hands stood silent, bearing witness to something sacred. These were hard men who'd worked brutal years on unforgiving land, but even they understood they were seeing something rare. The healing of two broken souls through the patient work of a third who'd been broken himself. Eventually Evelyn stepped back, wiping her eyes, and looked at Lucas with an expression he couldn't quite read. "The $500, she said. "You earned it, more than earned it. I'll have Coop get it from the safe." "I don't want the money," Lucas said quietly. "What?" "I didn't do this for money. I did it because Midnight needed someone to understand him, and I needed to remember what it felt like to connect with another living being. The money doesn't matter." Evelyn stared at him, this strange, quiet man who kept refusing everything she offered, while somehow giving back more than she knew how to accept. "Then what do you want?" Lucas looked at the ranch spread out around them, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the land turned green and rich by the rain. He looked at Coop and the ranch hands who'd become something like friends. He looked at Midnight standing beside him, finally at peace. And he looked at Evelyn, this fierce widow who was learning to be soft again, to be vulnerable again, to hope again. "I want to stay," he said simply. "I want to work here, help build that breeding program you mentioned, teach other horses what I've learned from Midnight. I want to belong somewhere for the first time in years. If you'll have me, if there's a place for me here." The silence that followed was broken only by rain drumming on the barn roof and water dripping from the eaves. Then Evelyn stepped forward and took Lucas's hand in both of hers. "There's a place for you here," she said firmly, "not just as a ranch hand or a horse trainer, as family, as someone who matters. You've given me back something I thought was gone forever, the understanding that partnership and trust are gifts, not things that can be demanded. That's worth more than any amount of money." Lucas felt something crack open inside his chest, some wall he'd built years ago to protect himself from caring too much, losing too much, hurting too much. It hurt to feel it break, but it also felt like breathing after being underwater too long, like coming home after years of wandering. "Then I'll stay," he said hoarsely, "as long as you'll have me." Coop cleared his throat, breaking the moment before it became too heavy. "Well, now that's settled. Maybe we should get this horse dried off and fed. And possibly the human too. You're both soaked to the bone." Everyone laughed, the tension releasing like a held breath, and they moved into action. Pete and Dutch took Midnight to the barn to rub him down and give him extra grain. Evelyn insisted Lucas come to the ranch house for dry clothes and hot coffee. The rain continued its steady rhythm, washing the valley clean, baptizing this new beginning with water instead of blood. In the ranch house kitchen, Lucas changed into some of Marcus's old clothes that Evelyn retrieved from storage. They fit well enough. Marcus had been a similar build, though perhaps an inch shorter. Wearing a dead man's clothes should have felt wrong, but somehow it felt like an honor, like Marcus was offering his blessing from beyond. Evelyn made coffee while Lucas sat at the kitchen table, watching her move through the familiar space with the ease of long practice. She'd changed into dry clothes as well and let her hair down from its usual severe braid. She looked younger, softer, more like the woman she must have been before grief carved her into something harder. "Can I ask you something?" she said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs and bringing them to the table. "Of course. Why did you really come here? To Dusthaven, I mean. Frank and Jesse told you about the challenge, but you could have just kept riding north. Why stop?" Lucas wrapped his hands around the hot mug, gathering his thoughts. "Because something in the story called to me. A widow searching for someone who understood what partnership meant. A horse that couldn't be dominated, only respected. It reminded me of something I'd lost, something I'd been running from for so long I'd almost forgotten what it was." "What was it?" "Purpose," Lucas said quietly. "Meaning. The sense that my life mattered to someone or something beyond just survival. After the war, I couldn't find that anymore. Couldn't find a reason to stay anywhere or care about anyone. So I kept moving, kept working temporary jobs, kept avoiding any connection that might require me to feel something again." He paused, sipping his coffee, then continued. "But when those cowboys told me about midnight, about how he'd lost his partner and refused to accept anyone else, I saw myself. And I thought maybe if I could help that horse find trust again, maybe I could find my own way back to being human instead of just existing." Evelyn nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "That's what I've been doing too. Just existing, going through the motions. The challenge wasn't really about finding someone good enough to ride midnight. It was about filling the hours so I didn't have to think about how empty everything felt without Marcus. And now? Now I think maybe I'm ready to actually live again, to build something new instead of just protecting what's left of the old." She met his eyes across the table. "You've helped me see that, Lucas, not just with midnight, but with the way you approach everything. You don't force or demand. You just show up, present, and patient, and let things unfold as they will." "That's all any of us can do," Lucas said. "Show up, be honest, hope that's enough." They talked for another hour, sharing stories from their pasts, learning each other's scars and dreams and fears. Lucas told her about the war, about the things he'd seen and done that still woke him sometimes in the night, about losing his family to illness while he was deployed, coming home to find everyone he'd loved buried and gone, about the years of drifting that followed, unable to anchor himself anywhere because anchoring meant caring, and caring meant the possibility of more loss. Evelyn told him about growing up on this ranch, about meeting Marcus at a barn dance when she was 19 and knowing immediately that he was different from other men, about building their life together, about the plans they'd made for children and expansion and growing old watching sunsets from this very porch, about the morning she'd ridden out and found his body broken in the dirt, and how something in her had died with him that day. "I thought I'd never feel anything but grief again," she admitted. "Thought I'd just be this hollow thing going through the motions until I died too. But watching you with midnight, seeing that trust rebuilt, it's like watching something in myself come back to life. Like maybe there's still room for hope, even after terrible loss." "There's always room for hope," Lucas said. "It's just sometimes we have to let ourselves be broken open before we can find it again." Over the following weeks, life on the Hawthorne Ranch settled into new rhythms. Lucas worked with Midnight daily, gradually building from those first tentative rides to longer sessions that took them across the ranch property. The horse rediscovered his joy in movement, in partnership, in having purpose again. They would ride out to check fence lines or move cattle, and Midnight responded to the lightest touch, the smallest shift in weight, as if Lucas's thoughts transmitted directly into action. Evelyn often rode with them on her mare, a gentle chestnut named Clover. She watched Lucas's methods with intense focus, learning how he communicated with Midnight through presence rather than force. She began applying the same principles to her own horsemanship, to her management of the ranch, even to her interactions with the hands who worked for her. The change was remarkable. Where once she'd ruled through stern demands and rigid expectations, she now led through clear communication and mutual respect. The ranch hands noticed and responded. Morale improved. Work got done more efficiently. Even old Coop, who'd been with the ranch for 20 years, commented that it felt like the place was finally breathing again, after holding its breath since Marcus died. Word spread through the territory about what had happened, how the impossible horse had been ridden, not through force, but through understanding. How the widow's challenge had been won by a quiet drifter who'd refused the prize money. People talked about it in saloons and general stores, the story growing with each retelling until it took on the proportions of legend. Some of those stories reached Gerald Blackwood, and they ate at him like acid. He'd been certain the challenge would never be won, that eventually Evelyn would give up and sell him the stallion. Now, not only had someone succeeded, but that someone had been given a permanent place on the ranch, was clearly being trusted with major responsibilities, and, if the rumors were true, was becoming far more than just a hired hand to the widow. Gerald stewed in his jealousy and pride for 3 weeks before he rode back to the Hawthorne Ranch, this time bringing 5 of his men with him. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low and red over the western mountains when they arrived. Lucas was in the main corral working with a young gelding, teaching the horse to respond to neck reining, when he heard the commotion. He looked up to see Gerald and his men riding into the yard, moving with the aggressive confidence of people who expected to get their way through intimidation. Evelyn emerged from the ranch house, Coop beside her, and her face went hard when she saw who'd arrived. "I told you to stay off my property, Gerald," she called out. "And I told you I'd be back," Gerald replied, dismounting. His men followed suit, fanning out in a semicircle that would have been threatening if Coop hadn't immediately whistled sharp and high. Pete, Dutch, and 4 other ranch hands emerged from the barn, each carrying rifles in a casual but unmistakable display of readiness. The numbers were even now, and Gerald's swagger faltered slightly. "No need for weapons," he said, raising his hands. "I'm just here to talk business." "We have no business," Evelyn said coldly. "I think we do. I've heard the stories about your drifter and that devil horse. Very impressive. But it doesn't change the fundamental situation. Midnight is too valuable an animal to be kept as a pet on a small ranch. He should be at stud, building a legacy, creating offspring that could change horsemanship across the territory." "He will be at stud," Evelyn replied. "Here, we're starting our own breeding program." Gerald's face darkened. "With what mares? You have Clover and 2 old draft horses. That's not a breeding program, that's a hobby. I have 20 mares of quality bloodlines. I can give Midnight the opportunities he deserves." "Midnight deserves to stay where he's respected and understood," Lucas said quietly, walking over from the corral. "Not where he'll be treated as livestock." Gerald turned his attention to Lucas, and his expression curdled with contempt. "The famous horse whisperer. Tell me, Drifter, what's your angle here? You planning to marry the widow and take over the ranch? Is that why you refused the money? Because you saw a bigger prize?" The insult was designed to provoke, to make Lucas react with anger or violence. Instead, Lucas just looked at Gerald with something approaching pity. "You don't understand what's happening here because you've never experienced it yourself. Partnership, trust, connection that isn't based on control or ownership. I feel sorry for you, Mr. Blackwood. You have wealth and land and power, but you've never had what Marcus Hawthorne had with his horse and his wife, and that poverty is something no amount of money can fix." The words hit harder than any punch. Gerald's face went purple with rage. "How dare you, a nobody, a vagrant, speak to me about poverty? I could buy and sell you 100 times over." "And you'd still be poor where it matters," Lucas said calmly. "In here," he tapped his chest. "In your capacity to see other beings as anything more than tools or trophies." For a moment, it looked like Gerald might actually swing at Lucas despite the rifles pointed in his general direction. But Evelyn stepped between them, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This conversation is over, Gerald. You've been told no multiple times. If you come back here again, I'll have the sheriff charge you with harassment. My patience is exhausted." "You're making a mistake," Gerald said through gritted teeth. "That horse is dangerous. Eventually he'll hurt someone. And when he does, I'll make sure everyone knows you were warned. I'll make sure you lose everything. This ranch, your reputation, maybe even your life if he kills you the way horses like that inevitably do." "Get out," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to something dangerous. "Now." Gerald held her gaze for another long moment, then spat in the dirt at her feet and turned to his horse. His men followed, mounting up quickly, and they rode out at a gallop, throwing up clouds of dust that hung in the evening air like smoke. When they were gone, Evelyn let out a shaky breath. "That's not over," she said. "Gerald doesn't give up when he wants something. He'll find another way to come at us." "Then we'll be ready," Coop said firmly. "We've got good people here, Mrs. Hawthorne. People who believe in what you're building. We won't let him destroy it." The ranch hands murmured agreement, and Lucas felt something warm spread through his chest. These people were becoming family, the kind that chose each other rather than being bound by blood, the kind that stood together when threats emerged. "Thank you," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you. For staying. For believing. For protecting what we're trying to build here." That night, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch had settled into darkness, Lucas sat on the porch steps looking at the stars. He heard the door open behind him and Evelyn emerged, carrying 2 glasses of whiskey. She handed him one and sat beside him. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said to Gerald, about partnership and trust, about what Marcus had." "I just spoke the truth," Lucas replied. "It was more than that. You defended not just me and Midnight, but the whole idea of what we're trying to do here. Build something based on respect rather than control. That matters, Lucas, more than you know." They sipped their whiskey in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. Then Evelyn said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "What do you see when you look at me? Not just as your employer or as Midnight's owner, but as a person." Lucas took his time answering, wanting to get the words right. "I see someone who loved deeply and lost terribly and survived anyway. Someone who's learning to be vulnerable again after building walls to protect herself. Someone who's stronger than she knows and kinder than she lets herself be. Someone who's beautiful, not despite her scars, but because of them, because they prove she's fought battles and come through the other side." Evelyn's breath caught. That's more than I expected. You asked for honesty." "I did." She paused, then continued. "Can I tell you what I see when I look at you? If you want. I see someone who understands loss the way I do, who carries grief like a familiar coat, but I also see someone who hasn't let that grief make him cruel or bitter. You're still capable of gentleness, of patience, of caring deeply even though caring means risking more hurt. That's remarkable, Lucas. After everything you've been through, you're still capable of being present for others. That takes a kind of courage I'm still trying to find." "You have it," Lucas said softly. "You showed it when you let me stay, when you trusted me with Midnight, when you chose to see him as a grieving being rather than a problem to be solved. You have courage, Evelyn. You just don't recognize it yet." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat like that for a long time, connected by touch and understanding and the slow, tentative growth of something that might become love if they were patient and honest and brave enough to let it. Over the next month, the breeding program began to take shape. Evelyn purchased 3 quality mares from ranches in neighboring territories, horses with good temperaments and strong bloodlines that would complement Midnight's qualities. Lucas worked with each mare individually, ensuring they were healthy and ready, teaching them to trust him so the breeding process would be as stress-free as possible. The first breeding was approached with careful consideration. They waited until one of the mares, a gray thoroughbred named Silver, showed clear signs of being in season. Then Lucas led her into the corral where Midnight waited. The stallion's interest was immediate, but his approach was gentle, respectful, showing the same consideration for the mare that he showed to Lucas and Evelyn. It was courtship rather than domination, and Silver responded with acceptance rather than fear. The breeding was successful, and within a few weeks it became clear that Silver was carrying. Evelyn marked the date on the calendar, already planning for the foal that would be born the following spring. This would be the first of Midnight's offspring since Marcus's death, the beginning of a legacy that would outlive them all. As autumn arrived and the valley began its annual transformation from green to gold, Lucas found himself settling into ranch life with surprising ease. He rose early each morning and worked until dusk, his tasks ranging from training horses to repairing equipment to helping with the cattle. The physical labor grounded him, gave his restless energy somewhere to go, and the routine provided structure he hadn't realized he needed. But more than the work, it was the connections that transformed him. The easy camaraderie with Pete and Dutch, The gruff approval from Coop when Lucas solved a problem or handled a difficult situation well. The quiet evenings on the porch with Evelyn, talking about everything and nothing, slowly learning each other's rhythms and preferences and dreams. They were building something together, not just a breeding program or a ranch, but a life. It was slower and more tentative than either of them had experienced before, scarred as they both were by loss. But it was real, honest, built on foundations of mutual respect and understanding rather than desperation or convenience. One evening in late October, as the first frost was settling over the valley and smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney, Evelyn called Lucas into the ranch house office. She was sitting at Marcus's old desk, ledgers spread before her, and she looked up as he entered with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Sit down," she said. "We need to talk about something." Lucas sat, his stomach tightening slightly. That phrase, "we need to talk," never preceded good news. "I've been going over the ranch finances," Evelyn began, "and I want to make some changes to how things are structured. The breeding program is going to require significant investment, more mares, better facilities, marketing to attract buyers. I can't do this alone, Lucas. I need a partner." "I'm here," Lucas said. "Whatever you need." "I know. That's why I'm offering you a full partnership in the ranch, not as a hired hand or even a foreman, but as a co-owner. Equal share in the land, the livestock, the profits, and the decisions." Lucas stared at her, certain he'd misunderstood. "Evelyn, I can't. That's too much. This is your family's ranch, your heritage. I've only been here a few months." "And in those months, you've given this ranch back its heart," Evelyn said firmly. "You've transformed Midnight, improved morale, brought new possibilities I couldn't have imagined. But more than that, you've shown me what partnership really means. And I want that partnership to be official, legal, permanent. I want to build this future together, Lucas, as equals." "What about Marcus? What about his memory, his legacy?" "Marcus would approve," Evelyn said with certainty. "He always said the land belongs to whoever loves it enough to nurture it. You love this place, these animals, this life. I see it in everything you do. And I think I'm starting to love you too, Lucas Reed. Not as a replacement for Marcus, but as yourself, for who you are and what we could be together." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and brave. Lucas felt his chest tighten with emotions he'd spent years suppressing. Hope, fear, longing, terror. To accept this offer meant accepting permanence, accepting the risk of loss, accepting that he mattered enough to someone that losing him would hurt them. It meant choosing to live instead of just survive. "I love you too," he said quietly, the words feeling rusty but true. "I've been afraid to admit it, afraid to care that much again. But I do. I love you, Evelyn. I love this ranch, this life, the possibility of building something that lasts." "Then say yes," she whispered. "Be my partner, in business and in life. Help me build something Marcus would be proud of." Lucas stood and crossed to where she sat, taking her hands in his and pulling her gently to her feet. "Yes," he said, "to all of it. Partnership, permanence, building a life together. Yes." They kissed then, tentative at first and then with growing confidence, two wounded people choosing to trust love again despite knowing its cost. It wasn't the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper, more sustainable. The love of two adults who'd seen the worst life could offer and decided to reach for the best anyway. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. "We should tell the hands," Evelyn said. "They'll want to know." "Tomorrow," Lucas replied. "Tonight, let's just be. Just us, sitting with this decision, letting it settle." They spent the evening on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the barn, Midnight whinnied softly, and they could hear the answering call of the mares. New life was growing in Silver's belly, new possibilities unfolding with each passing day. They had chosen trust over fear, partnership over control, hope over grief. And in that choosing, they had found not just each other but themselves, the best versions of who they could be when they stopped running from connection and started building toward it instead. It wasn't the ending either of them had imagined when their stories began. But it was real and honest and filled with the kind of quiet joy that sustains through seasons of hardship. It was enough. More than enough. It was home. Part 5, lưu ý trong nghe viết sau thu nền so 500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Trong câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document 14, câu chồng 7. Part 5. Home found winter arrived in Dust Haven Valley with the kind of cold that made your bones ache and your breath hang visible in the air like ghosts of words unspoken. Snow fell heavy on the mountains and dusted the valley floor, transforming the ranch into something from a painting, white-covered fields stretching toward peaks that gleamed silver in the weak winter sun. Lucas woke each morning in the ranch house now, in the room that had once been Marcus's office, but was being slowly converted into a proper bedroom. Evelyn had insisted he move out of the bunkhouse the week after they'd made their partnership official, both the legal kind drawn up by the town lawyer and the personal kind that grew stronger with each passing day. They hadn't married yet. Both felt it was too soon, that they needed time to build their foundation properly before making such permanent declarations. But they lived as partners in every meaningful sense, sharing meals and decisions and the quiet intimacy of two people learning to trust again. Some nights Evelyn would wake from nightmares about finding Marcus's body, and Lucas would hold her until the shaking stopped. Other nights, Lucas would bolt awake from war dreams, and Evelyn would talk him back to present reality with her steady voice describing the ranch, the mountains, the life they were building together. They healed each other in small increments, patient as the seasons. The breeding program was thriving. Silver was well into her pregnancy, her belly swelling with Midnight's first foal since Marcus's death. The other 2 mares they'd purchased had also been successfully bred, and Evelyn was already fielding inquiries from ranchers across 3 territories who wanted to purchase offspring from the legendary Stallion. Word had spread about how Midnight had been gentled not through force, but through understanding, and people were willing to pay premium prices for horses that carried his bloodline and the promise of his intelligence and temperament. Lucas spent his days working with the horses, teaching them the same principles he'd learned from Midnight, that partnership meant mutual respect, that trust couldn't be forced, that the best relationships between human and animal came from honoring the animal's autonomy rather than breaking their spirit. He was building a reputation as someone who could gentle even the most difficult horses, and ranchers were starting to bring their problem animals to the Hawthorne Ranch for training. The money was good. Better than good. By midwinter, the ranch's finances had improved dramatically, and Evelyn was able to hire 2 additional hands to help with the expanded operations. But more valuable than the money was the satisfaction Lucas felt doing work that mattered, work that made the world gentler rather than harder, work that honored life rather than diminishing it. He'd found his purpose again, and with it, a reason to stay rooted instead of drifting. On a bitter cold morning in late January, Lucas was in the barn checking on Silver when Coop came rushing in, his weathered face tight with concern. "We got trouble," the foreman said without preamble. "Gerald Blackwood's at the property line with about 15 men. They're not crossing onto our land, but they're making their presence known. Pete's watching them from the North Ridge." Lucas set down the brush he'd been using on Silver and walked quickly toward the barn door, Coop following. They found Evelyn already on the porch, shading her eyes against the winter sun's glare off the snow, looking toward the northern boundary of the ranch. Even from this distance, they could see the cluster of horses and men gathered there, a dark stain against the white landscape. "How long have they been there?" Lucas asked. "Pete says about an hour. They showed up right after dawn, been sitting there since, not doing anything, just watching." "Intimidation tactic," Evelyn said, her voice hard. "Gerald knows he can't legally force me to sell, so he's trying to make us uncomfortable, make us feel unsafe." Is it working? Lucas asked quietly. She turned to look at him, and he could see the fear beneath her anger, the memory of being vulnerable and alone before he'd arrived. But he also saw something else: determination, strength, the resolve of someone who'd decided she wouldn't be pushed around anymore. No, she said firmly. He doesn't get to make me afraid on my own land. This is our home, Lucas. We don't surrender it to bullies. Lucas nodded and went to saddle Midnight. If Gerald wanted a show of strength, he'd get one. Not the kind that came from violence or threats, but the kind that came from standing your ground with quiet confidence. He rode out toward the northern boundary, Midnight's black coat stark against the snow, and he could feel eyes tracking their approach from both sides, Gerald's men watching from the property line, and the ranch hands watching from positions around the ranch buildings. When Lucas reached the fence that marked the boundary, he stopped about 20 yards back and sat easy in the saddle, waiting. Gerald detached from his group and rode forward, stopping on his side of the line. "Quite a horse," Gerald called out, his voice carrying across the cold air. "Even more impressive up close. You've done well with him, Drifter. Almost makes me regret not hiring you myself when you first showed up." "You couldn't afford what I cost," Lucas replied calmly. "And I don't mean money." Gerald's smile was thin and cold. "Always with the philosophy. You think you're better than other men because you can sit still and whisper to horses? That's not strength. That's just patience pretending to be virtue." "Why are you here, Gerald? What do you want?" "I want what I've always wanted. That Stallion. And I'm prepared to make a final offer. $10,000. That's more than this entire ranch is worth. And we both know it. Evelyn can keep her land, keep her house, keep her pride. She just needs to sell me the horse." "He's not for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price," Gerald said. $10,000 is the right price. Take it back to her. Tell her she has 1 week to accept or I withdraw the offer permanently." "And then what? You keep showing up here with your men, trying to intimidate her into changing her mind?" Gerald's expression hardened. "I'm a patient man, but my patience has limits. If she won't sell willingly, there are other ways to persuade her. Accidents happen on ranches, fires, sick livestock, fences that mysteriously break in the night. Would be a shame if something happened to compromise her operation." The threat was clear, and Lucas felt anger rise hot in his chest, but he kept his voice level, his posture relaxed. "You're threatening sabotage because you can't accept being told no. That's not patience, Gerald. That's the tantrum of a spoiled child." "Watch your mouth, Drifter." "Or what? You'll hurt me? Hurt the ranch? Hurt Evelyn?" Lucas leaned forward slightly in the saddle, and his voice dropped to something harder, colder, carrying the weight of years he'd spent as a soldier learning how to kill efficiently. "Let me make something very clear. You come at this ranch, you come at that woman, you try anything at all to harm what we're building here, and I will make sure you regret it in ways that keep you awake at night. I don't make threats, Gerald. I make promises. And I promise you that touching anything or anyone on this ranch will be the last mistake you ever make." The change in Lucas's demeanor was subtle but complete. He'd been patient, gentle, philosophical. Now he was something else, something that had survived war and death and darkness, something that understood violence intimately, even while choosing not to use it. Gerald saw it, and his face went pale. Whatever he'd expected from the quiet horse trainer, it wasn't this glimpse of barely leashed danger. "You're bluffing," Gerald said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Try me and find out." Lucas straightened back up, and just like that, the danger receded. He was just a man on a horse again, calm and still. "Take your men and leave, Gerald. Don't come back. Find some other obsession to fill your empty life. This one's going to get you hurt." He turned Midnight around without waiting for a response and rode back toward the ranch at an easy walk. Behind him, he could hear Gerald shouting something to his men, the sound of horses being spurred into motion. But they were riding away, heading back toward Blackwood's property, and Lucas knew with certainty that Gerald wouldn't be returning anytime soon. Men like Gerald understood power and force. When they met someone who possessed real capacity for violence but chose restraint, it frightened them more than any overt threat could. When Lucas reached the ranch yard, he found Evelyn waiting with Coop in the hands, all of them tense and ready for trouble. They relaxed when they saw he was alone and unharmed. "What happened?" Evelyn asked. "What did he want?" The same thing he's always wanted. Midnight. He offered $10,000, and when I refused, he threatened sabotage if you didn't sell within a week. Lucas dismounted and started unsaddling the stallion. I made it clear that any move against this ranch would be answered in kind. He won't be back. You're certain? I'm certain. I let him see something he didn't expect, and it scared him badly enough that his pride will keep him away. Men like Gerald can't stand being frightened. They'll rationalize it as strategic withdrawal rather than admit they were intimidated. Evelyn studied his face, seeing the residue of whatever Lucas had shown Gerald still lingering in his eyes. What did you let him see? The part of me that survived the war, Lucas said quietly. The part I try to keep buried because it doesn't fit with the life I want to live. But it's still there, and men like Gerald need to know it exists even if I never use it. She nodded slowly, understanding. They all had parts of themselves they kept hidden, demons they'd rather not acknowledge. The fact that Lucas could access his when necessary but chose not to let them rule him was part of what made him trustworthy. Thank you, she said simply, for protecting us. We protect each other, Lucas replied. That's what family does. The word hung in the cold air, family. It was the first time any of them had said it out loud, acknowledging what they'd been building together. Not just a business or a ranch, but a chosen family bound by shared values and mutual care. Coop cleared his throat, breaking the moment. Well, if the excitement's over, we got work to do. Those fence posts on the east pasture aren't going to repair themselves. Life resumed its rhythms after that. Gerald kept his distance, and gradually his presence faded from daily concern to occasional memory. The winter deepened and then began its slow retreat as February arrived with slightly longer days and the promise of spring hiding beneath the snow. Silver's pregnancy advanced, her movements becoming more careful, her appetite increasing. Lucas checked on her multiple times daily, wanting to be prepared when the foaling began. It happened on a cold night in early March, when the wind was howling down from the mountains and snow fell in thick sheets. Lucas was doing his evening check on the horses when he found Silver pacing her stall, restless and uncomfortable. He recognized the signs immediately. The foal was coming. He ran to the house and found Evelyn in the kitchen making tea. It's time, he said breathlessly. Silver's in labor. They rushed to the barn together, grabbing lanterns and supplies, and spent the next 4 hours attending the birth. It was Lucas's first time helping with a foaling, and despite his nervousness, he found himself drawn into the primal intensity of it. The mare's labored breathing, the gradual emergence of tiny hooves, the final push that brought a wet, trembling foal sliding into the world. It was a colt, black as his father with a small white star on his forehead. He was perfect, long-legged and bright-eyed, already trying to stand within minutes of being born. Silver cleaned him with her tongue, murmuring soft sounds, and the colt responded with his own small whinnies. Lucas and Evelyn stood back, giving mother and baby space, both of them overcome with emotion at witnessing this new life. This was Midnight's legacy, Marcus's legacy, their legacy, the beginning of something that would outlive them all. He's beautiful, Evelyn whispered, tears streaming down her face. He is, Lucas agreed, his own voice thick. What should we name him? Evelyn thought for a moment, then smiled. Marcus always said that hope is what carries us through the darkest times. Let's call him Promise, because he represents the promise of a future, of new beginnings, of things getting better. Promise, Lucas repeated, and the colt's ears swiveled toward the sound of his name. I like it. They stayed in the barn until Promise was steady on his feet and nursing successfully, then returned to the house as dawn was breaking over the mountains. They were exhausted, covered in straw and sweat, but happier than either had felt in years. Life was continuing, generation to generation, and they were part of that continuity. Spring arrived fully by mid-March, melting the snow and turning the valley green. The other two mares foaled within weeks of each other, a filly and another colt, both healthy and strong. The ranch was suddenly full of young horses learning to navigate the world, and Lucas spent hours working with them, teaching them to trust human touch, to accept halters, to follow basic commands. He was building the foundation for their entire lives, and he took the responsibility seriously. Word spread about the successful foaling, and inquiries about purchasing Midnight's offspring increased dramatically. Evelyn started a waiting list,
carefully vetting potential buyers to ensure the horses would go to homes where they'd be treated well. She turned down several offers from people who wanted the horses purely as status symbols, holding out for buyers who understood what made these animals special. By late spring, she'd secured buyers for all 3 foals at prices that would keep the ranch profitable for years. But she and Lucas agreed to keep promise, to raise him as Midnight's heir, to build their breeding program around him. On a warm evening in May, Evelyn and Lucas sat on the porch watching Promise and the other foals play in the pasture, running and bucking with the pure joy of young things discovering their bodies and their world. Midnight stood nearby, watching his offspring with what looked like paternal pride. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said, taking Lucas's hand, "about what we talked about last fall, about making this partnership permanent." Lucas turned to look at her, his heart suddenly pounding. And I think I'm ready, if you are, to get married, to make this official in every way. Are you sure? There's no rush, Evelyn. We have time. I know we have time, but I also know what I want, and I want this. I want you, not as a replacement for Marcus, but as yourself, as the man who helped me remember how to live instead of just survive. I love you, Lucas Reed. Will you marry me? The words hung between them, a question and an offering and a promise all at once. Lucas felt tears prick his eyes, overwhelmed by the gift of being chosen, being loved, being wanted enough that someone would risk the pain of potential loss to build a life with him. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "Yes, I'll marry you. I love you, Evelyn. You gave me a reason to stop running, a place to call home. You gave me back my life." They kissed as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and around them the ranch hummed with life and possibility. Promise whinnied from the pasture, and Midnight answered, and somewhere in the barn a mare shifted in her stall. The sounds of home, of family, of a future being built one day at a time. They married in June on the ranch, with Coop officiating and all the hands in attendance. It was a simple ceremony, no fancy clothes or elaborate decorations, just honest vows spoken under open sky with the mountains as witnesses. Evelyn wore a simple white dress she'd bought in town, and Lucas wore Marcus's old suit that Evelyn had carefully altered to fit him. It felt right wearing those clothes, not erasing Marcus but honoring him, acknowledging that he'd been the foundation on which this new life was built. Walt Driscoll came from town with half the population of Dusthaven, wanting to witness the widow's remarriage to the quiet drifter who'd won the impossible challenge. There was genuine happiness in their congratulations, relief that Evelyn had found peace again, curiosity about what the future would bring. The celebration lasted into the evening with food and music and dancing. Lucas found himself pulled into conversations with ranchers interested in buying horses, with townspeople who'd heard stories about his methods with difficult animals, with young cowboys who wanted to learn his techniques. He answered questions patiently, deflecting praise, always pointing back to the horses themselves as the real teachers. As the party wound down and guests began departing, Evelyn pulled Lucas aside. "There's one more thing," she said, leading him toward the barn. "A wedding gift." Inside, she led him to Midnight's stall. The stallion was standing calmly, but there was something different about his tack. Instead of his usual halter, he wore an ornate bridle with silver fittings, clearly custom-made and expensive. "It was Marcus's," Evelyn explained. "He commissioned it for Midnight but died before it was finished. The silversmith finally completed it last month, and I thought you should have it. You're Midnight's partner now, the way Marcus was. This belongs to you." Lucas ran his fingers over the intricate metalwork, feeling the weight of the gift both literally and symbolically. This wasn't just a bridle. It was acceptance, blessing, the passing of responsibility from one horseman to another across the boundary of death. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll honor this. I'll honor him and you and everything we're building. I know you will. That's why I'm giving it to you." The summer passed in a blur of work and growth. The foals matured rapidly under Lucas's guidance, learning not just obedience but thinking, problem-solving, true partnership with their handlers. Buyers who'd purchased them sent regular updates about how exceptional the horses were proving to be. Intelligent, trainable, spirited, but not dangerous. Exactly what Evelyn and Lucas had promised.
Inquiries for future breedings increased, and Evelyn expanded their operation, purchasing additional quality mares and hiring another experienced hand to help with the training. The Hawthorne Ranch was becoming known across multiple territories as the place to acquire horses that were partners rather than just tools. Lucas found himself training other people as much as horses, young cowboys who wanted to learn his methods, other trainers frustrated by their inability to connect with difficult animals, even a few women who'd been told they were too soft for horsework and were proving their critics wrong. He shared what he knew freely, believing that making the world gentler to animals made it better for everyone. One afternoon in late July, a wagon rolled into the ranch yard carrying a family Lucas didn't recognize. The man driving was maybe 40, worn down by hard years, with a woman beside him who looked equally exhausted, and 3 children in the back ranging from maybe 6 to 14. They had the look of people who'd traveled far with little resources, everything they owned probably in that wagon. Lucas walked out to meet them as Evelyn emerged from the house, both wary of strangers but willing to hear them out. "Help you folks?" Lucas asked. The man climbed down from the wagon, hat in his hands, nervous. "We heard, that is, we were told that this ranch sometimes takes on people who need work, people who are down on their luck but willing to earn their keep." "Who told you that?" Evelyn asked. "A cowboy we met 3 days' ride south. Said he'd worked here, said the owners were fair people who understood that sometimes good folks hit hard times through no fault of their own. Said you might have work if we were willing." Lucas and Evelyn exchanged glances. They hadn't explicitly spread word that they'd help people in need, but apparently their reputation had expanded beyond just horses. Lucas thought about his own arrival at this ranch, broke, alone, carrying nothing but his skills and his scars. Evelyn had taken a chance on him, and it had changed everything. "What kind of work can you do?" Lucas asked. "Anything, sir. Ranch work, fence repair, barn building. My wife's good with cooking and cleaning if you need household help. Our oldest boy, Daniel, he's got a way with animals. The younger 2 are still learning, but they're hard workers, both of them." Lucas looked at the family, at their threadbare clothes and hungry eyes, at the hope warring with fear of rejection on their faces. He saw himself in them, the desperation of people trying to survive in an unforgiving world. "We could use help," he said, making the decision, "especially with the expanded operations. Can't promise luxury, but we've got a small cabin that's empty, and we pay fair wages. You work hard, treat the animals and people with respect, and you'll have a place here as long as you need it." The man's face crumpled with relief. "Thank you. Thank you, sir. We won't let you down. I'm Lucas, and this is Evelyn. We're partners, both of us, so you report to either of us. What's your name?" "Tom Fletcher. This is my wife, Sarah, and our children, Daniel, Emma, and little Tom." They shook hands, and Lucas directed Coop to help the Fletchers settle into the small cabin on the east side of the property. As he watched them unload their meager possessions, Evelyn came to stand beside him. "We're going to keep doing this, aren't we?" she said, "taking in people who need a chance. Would that be wrong?" "No, it's exactly what Marcus would have done. He always said this ranch was supposed to be more than just a business. It was supposed to be a place where things were done right, where animals and people both were treated with dignity." "Then we'll honor that," Lucas said. "Build something bigger than just breeding horses. Build a community of people who believe in the same things we do." Over the following year, the ranch continued to grow and evolve. Tom Fletcher proved to be an excellent worker, and his son Daniel did indeed have a gift with animals. They became integral parts of the ranch operation. 2 more families arrived over the winter, sent by people who'd worked there before, and each time Lucas and Evelyn found space and work for them if they were genuinely in need and willing to work. The ranch was becoming something more than just a business. It was becoming a haven for people who'd been knocked down by life but refused to stay down. People who understood that dignity wasn't about wealth or status, but about how you treated others and yourself. People who were willing to build something meaningful through honest effort. Lucas found himself thinking often about the journey that had brought him here. The war, the losses, the years of drifting, the moment he'd heard about a widow's impossible challenge and decided to ride toward it instead of past it. Every choice had led him to this place, this life, this family he'd built from nothing but patience and presence. On a spring morning, 2 years after he'd first arrived at the Hawthorne Ranch, Lucas stood at the corral fence watching promise, now a 2-year-old stallion showing all his father's intelligence and spirit, work with one of the new trainers. The young horse moved with the same fluid grace Midnight possessed, responding to subtle cues, thinking through problems, showing the kind of partnership that Lucas had spent years learning to recognize and nurture. Evelyn joined him at the fence, slipping her hand into his, and they watched in comfortable silence as the training session progressed. In the pasture beyond, Midnight grazed peacefully, surrounded by his growing family of offspring. The stallion was older now, gray beginning to show around his muzzle, but his eyes were still bright and his spirit still strong. "I was thinking," Evelyn said quietly, "about the challenge, about how 26 men failed before you arrived." "What about it?" "I was wrong about what I was testing for. I thought I was looking for someone strong enough to dominate Midnight, someone who could break him the way I thought Marcus had. But Marcus never broke him. He understood him. And I was actually looking for someone who could understand what that meant. That real strength isn't about force or control. It's about respect, patience, presence." "You found what you were looking for," Lucas said. "Just not in the way you expected." "I found more than I was looking for. I found a partner, a family, a future I'd stopped believing was possible." She turned to look at him, her eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you, Lucas, for being exactly who you are, for not giving up on me or Midnight when we were both so lost." "Thank you for giving me a reason to stop running," Lucas replied, "for showing me that home isn't a place you're born to. It's a place you choose, and that chooses you back." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, warming the valley, bringing another day of work and purpose and connection. The ranch bustled around them, hands feeding livestock, horses moving through their training routines, children laughing as they chased each other through the yard. Life in all its messy, beautiful complexity, built on foundations of trust and respect and the radical belief that everyone and everything deserved dignity. Years later, when people would ask Lucas about his time at the Hawthorne Ranch, about how he'd won the widow's impossible challenge, he would always smile and shake his head. "I didn't win anything," he'd say. "I just showed up and sat down. Everything else, the trust, the partnership, the life we built, that was earned through presence and patience. That was horses and people teaching me what matters most." And if they pressed him to explain what that was, what mattered most, he'd look toward the mountains and think about a black stallion who'd lost everything and learned to trust again, about a widow who'd transformed grief into purpose, about families built from broken pieces and held together by choice rather than blood. "Connection," he'd finally say. "Being seen and seeing others in return. That's what matters. Everything else is just details." The Hawthorne Ranch continued for generations after Lucas and Evelyn passed, their children and grandchildren carrying forward the principles they'd established. That strength came from understanding rather than force. That trust was built through consistent presence. That everyone deserved dignity regardless of their past or their station. Horses bred there became known throughout the West for their intelligence and temperament, and people trained there spread those same values across dozens of ranches and territories. But the heart of the legacy wasn't the horses or the money or even the methods. It was the simple truth that Lucas had lived and taught through his every action. Some challenges aren't meant to break you. They're meant to reveal who you truly are. And sometimes, being a real cowboy has nothing to do with roping or riding or any conventional measure of toughness. Sometimes it's just about showing up, being present, and choosing truth over performance, partnership over domination, love over fear. In the end, that was the victory that mattered. Not conquering the unconquerable horse, but learning to see the grief beneath the rage, the loneliness beneath the fury, the possibility of connection beneath the armor of self-protection. And having the courage to offer your own vulnerability in return, trusting that sometimes broken things can heal together into something stronger than they ever were apart. That was what Lucas found in Dust Haven Valley. That was what he gave back to Evelyn, to Midnight, to every person and animal he worked with for the rest of his life. Not control, not mastery, just the gift of being truly present, truly seeing, truly honoring the autonomy and dignity of every living being he encountered. And in the doing, he found what he'd been searching for all those years of drifting. A place where he belonged, not because he'd conquered or dominated or forced his way in, but because he'd been patient enough, humble enough, and brave enough to let himself be chosen. Home, it turned out, was never about the land or the buildings or even the work. Home was about being seen completely and loved anyway. About seeing others completely and loving them, not despite their wounds, but because those wounds proved they'd survived, they'd fought, they'd refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. Home was Evelyn's hand in his as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. It was midnight's soft wicker when Lucas entered the barn each morning. It was the laughter of children playing in the yard and the satisfaction of work done well, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another chance to build something meaningful. Home was what you created when you stopped running and started showing up. When you stopped pretending and started being honest. When you stopped demanding and started offering. When you chose trust over fear, presence over absence, connection over isolation. That was the real challenge all along, not riding the unrideable horse, but learning to be the kind of person the horse would choose to carry. Not winning the widow's approval, but becoming the kind of partner who deserved it. Not proving you were a real cowboy by some external standard, but discovering what being real actually meant. And Lucas had proven it in the only way that mattered, by showing up as himself, flawed and scarred and uncertain, and staying present through all the difficulty and discomfort until trust could grow in the space he'd created through his patient, humble persistence. That was his legacy. That was their legacy. And it echoed forward through time, touching lives they'd never know, changing hearts they'd never meet, proving again and again that the hardest battles are fought inside, that the greatest victories are invisible, and that real courage looks like sitting still when every instinct screams at you to run. In Dusthaven Valley, the story of the widow's challenge became legend, passed down through generations, changing slightly with each telling, but always keeping its essential truth. Some tests aren't about dominating what stands before you. They're about understanding it, respecting it, and having the humility to let it teach you what strength really means. And sometimes, when you're least expecting it, the challenge you set for others ends up transforming you instead. That was Evelyn's final gift to herself, recognizing that she'd been asking the wrong question all along. Not, who is man enough to ride this horse, but who is human enough to see him as more than a test? And in finding Lucas, in watching him build trust through presence rather than force, she discovered the answer to the question her heart had been asking since Marcus died. Was it possible to love again? To build again? To hope again? The answer, she learned, was yes. Always yes. As long as you were willing to be patient, to be vulnerable, to choose connection even when isolation felt safer. As long as you were willing to sit in the dust and wait, offering nothing but your honest presence, until the other slowly, cautiously decided you might be worth trusting. That was how everything good was built, not through grand gestures or dramatic conquests, but through small, consistent acts of showing up and being real and honoring the dignity of all living things. That was how horses learned to carry humans willingly. That was how broken hearts learned to love again. That was how strangers became family and houses became homes and survival became something worth calling life. And that, in the end, was what made Lucas Reed a real cowboy. Not his skill with horses or his patience or even his understanding, but his willingness to be seen completely and to see others the same way, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than unilateral control, to believe that everyone deserved dignity regardless of whether they could offer anything in return. He'd arrived at the Hawthorne Ranch looking for nothing more than temporary work and a reason to keep moving. He'd stayed because he'd found something he didn't even know he'd been searching for. A home built not on foundations of stone, but on the radical, revolutionary act of choosing presence over power, vulnerability over invincibility, love over loneliness. And in that choosing, he'd discovered the truth that the best cowboys had always known but rarely articulated. Real mastery isn't about bending the world to your will. It's about learning to move with it, to listen to it, to let it teach you how to be more human than you knew you could be. That was the victory no one expected, the kind that couldn't be quantified or awarded or mounted on a wall, the kind that lived in the quiet moments between heartbeats, in the trust between a man and a horse, in the love between two people who'd been brave enough to risk caring again. That was everything. And it was enough, more than enough. It was home.